Chapter 1. The Awakening. Darkness shrouded the small, windowless room. The air hung heavy with dampness, thick with the smell of rust and decay. A man lay on the cold, hard concrete floor, unconscious. His limbs were splayed awkwardly, and his breathing was shallow. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the gloom. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, punctuated by the irregular ticking of an unseen clock. The man's heart began to pound as his senses returned, bringing with them an overwhelming dread. Disoriented, he struggled to push himself up, but a sharp pain shot through his wrist. Gasping, he glanced down to find a rusty metal shackle locked tightly around it, connected to a thick chain bolted to the wall. The chain rattled as he tugged at it in vain, the heavy links refusing to budge. Panic flared in his chest as he frantically scanned the room, searching for any sign of escape. Dim, flickering lights revealed the room's sparse and grim contents. On the opposite wall, a cracked mirror reflected his terrified expression, showing dirt-streaked skin and hollow eyes filled with confusion. A worn, wooden table stood nearby, its surface marred by deep gouges and stains. In the center of the table lay a single, ominous object, a tarnished metal box with a small keyhole. The box was old, with twisted designs etched into its surface. Despite its weathered appearance, it seemed to pulse with sinister energy, as if it held something of great importance. The man's breathing quickened as he dragged himself closer to the table, his shackled wrists scraping against the rough floor. His eyes remained fixed on the box, a gnawing feeling in his gut telling him it held a key to his survival, or perhaps his doom. Beside the box was a slip of yellowed paper, frayed at the edges. Carefully, he stretched out a trembling hand to pick it up. The paper's message was simple, written in block letters. Time is running out. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed a countdown timer affixed to the wall above the mirror. It was already ticking down, each second bringing him closer to an unknown fate. Desperation clawed at him as he realized he had only two choices: solve whatever puzzle this was or face the consequences. He scanned the room once more, his eyes darting between the box, the timer, and the shackle binding him. The seconds slipped away mercilessly, his mind racing to piece together the clues. He knew instinctively that every element in the room was deliberate, placed with precision to lead him either towards salvation or destruction. The rusty chain clinked again as he tried to stretch the distance further, but it wasn't enough to reach the box. Realizing the futility of struggling against his restraints, he turned his attention inward, attempting to calm his thoughts. He forced himself to study the box carefully, noting every detail of its twisted carvings. The keyhole was small, and the designs appeared to form a pattern, perhaps a clue hidden within the symbols themselves. The man's thoughts swirled in confusion and fear, yet he knew time was slipping away. Sweat dripped down his face as the timer's digits ticked steadily downward. There were still countless questions haunting his mind. Who put him here? Why was he chosen? And most importantly, how could he escape this nightmare? But there was no time to dwell on them now. Survival depended on solving the riddle before the clock reached zero. As he frantically scanned the room one last time, his gaze settled on a small, glinting object hidden in a corner, partially obscured by shadows. Crawling across the floor, he reached out with trembling fingers to retrieve it. The object, a tiny, rusted key, gleamed faintly in the dim light. His pulse quickened with hope, but also with fear. He knew this key was more than it appeared, likely opening the box that could determine his fate. The man returned to the table, his hands shaking as he fumbled to insert the key into the box. It slid into place, but the tension in his chest tightened as he hesitated to turn it. He felt the weight of every second, every breath pressing down on him as the timer ticked mercilessly forward. He knew whatever awaited inside could be the difference between life and death. With a deep breath, he twisted the key. The box creaked open, revealing its contents. But before he could see what lay within, a sudden metallic clank echoed in the room. The chain binding him jerked violently, tightening around his wrist. The lights dimmed further, casting sinister shadows across the room. The box's lid creaked wider, revealing not salvation, but the beginning of something much darker. Whatever was inside, it held the key to this twisted game, a game where every choice was a test, and every mistake could be fatal. As the man stared into the abyss of the open box, the timer continued its relentless countdown, signaling that his true trial had only just begun. Chapter 2: The First Trap. The cold air clung to the man's skin as he stared into the box, its contents now fully revealed. Inside, nestled in a bed of rotting velvet, lay a crude metal device, jagged and sinister in its design. The device seemed almost alive, like some twisted creation born from a nightmare. Its darkened gears, rusted blades, and interlocking mechanisms spoke of pain and suffering, of something designed with one purpose: torment. His heart thudded loudly in his chest as he reached out with trembling fingers. The device was small enough to hold in one hand, but felt unnervingly heavy as he lifted it from the box. With the device now in his grasp, he could see its full structure: a collar lined with sharpened spikes on the inside, designed to encircle the neck. Thin wires connected the spikes to a set of miniature locks and gears that seemed poised to activate at the slightest movement. Beneath the device, the velvet lining of the box concealed a second object, an old, tarnished key. But this key was different from the one he had just used. Its jagged teeth were thicker, irregular, and stained with dried blood. Instinctively, he knew this key was critical, but its purpose remained unclear. His mind raced, piecing together the possibilities, while the clock on the wall continued its relentless countdown, pushing him closer to the unknown. The man turned the collar over in his hands, examining every detail. It was clear that it was designed to be worn, forced onto him as the next stage of this twisted game. His eyes flitted back to the clock, watching the numbers slip away with brutal finality. He realized he had no choice but to comply with whatever sick rules were set in this place. Moving with the urgency of a man with no other options, he lifted the collar to his neck. The cold metal bit into his skin as he struggled to fasten it, his hands shaking with both fear and revulsion. The spikes hovered just millimeters away from piercing his throat. It took every ounce of willpower to click the locks into place, securing the collar tightly around his neck. Each movement caused the gears to whir faintly, a grim reminder that a wrong step could end in agony. With the collar locked on, the next phase of his nightmare began. A loud creak reverberated through the room as a hidden panel in the wall slid open. Behind it, a dark, narrow passageway stretched into the shadows, leading into parts unknown. The passage beckoned him forward, its yawning darkness promising both dread and the slim hope of escape. The chain binding him clinked softly as it slid free, retracting into the wall as if it had served its purpose. The man rubbed his sore wrist briefly, but there was no time to dwell on the pain. The countdown timer on the wall flashed red, signaling that he needed to move. Without hesitation, he crawled through the newly revealed passage, leaving behind the dim light of the room for the oppressive shadows ahead. The passage was suffocatingly tight, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. Each step brought the sound of grinding metal as the gears in the collar adjusted to his movements. The faintest brush against the walls caused the spikes to press closer to his skin, threatening to pierce his flesh if he made the slightest wrong move. Beads of sweat ran down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he focused all his energy on navigating the cramped space. The darkness closed in as he pressed forward, his body scraping against the rough, uneven surfaces of the passage. Every few feet, he was forced to crawl over broken glass, twisted nails, and debris scattered along the floor. Each sharp jab of pain sent fresh waves of panic through him, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving, knowing that stopping meant death. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into another chamber. This room was larger, but just as foreboding. The walls were lined with corroded pipes that hissed and groaned, leaking foul-smelling steam into the air. In the center of the room stood a table, much like the one in the previous chamber, but this one had a large metal contraption fixed on it, something akin to a crude guillotine. Above the table, a monitor flickered to life, displaying another timer, this one already ticking down from just 3 minutes. On the table lay a mangled mannequin, its head locked beneath the guillotine blade. The scene sent chills down the man's spine as he realized what was expected of him. The tarnished key he carried was clearly meant to be used here, but the riddle was more complex than it first appeared. He knew that any mistake could trigger a fatal outcome. With time slipping away, he studied the mechanism surrounding the guillotine. The keyhole was on the side, connected to a series of levers and gears that controlled the blade. Sweat dripped from his brow as he inserted the key and turned it slowly. The gears clanked into motion, and the timer on the monitor began to speed up, ticking down faster with each passing second. Panic surged through him as he realized he had to make a choice. The mannequin was clearly just a stand-in for what could happen to him next if he failed. The guillotine's blade glinted menacingly as it inched downward, poised to strike if the puzzle remained unsolved. With trembling hands, he adjusted the levers, trying to align the gears into the correct position. The grinding of metal echoed in the room as the contraption fought back against his every move. Just as the timer neared its final moments, he felt the gears click into place. The monitor flashed a new message. The first test ends. The guillotine's blade froze, suspended just millimeters from the mannequin's neck. A heavy breath escaped his lungs as he slumped to the floor, the strain of the ordeal taking its toll. But there was no relief in his victory. The collar around his neck buzzed faintly, reminding him that his trial was far from over. The room remained deadly silent, but the darkness in the passage beyond seemed to stir, beckoning him forward once more. With no other options, the man dragged himself to his feet and stepped toward the next unknown challenge. Each step a journey deeper into the twisted mind of whoever had orchestrated this living nightmare. Chapter 3: Silent Panic. The air grew colder as the man stumbled forward into the next chamber, each step a reminder of the collar's cruel embrace around his neck. The darkness of the passageway clung to him like a shroud, broken only by the faint, flickering lights ahead. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, loud enough to drown out the eerie silence that dominated the space. The chamber he entered was larger than the previous two, its walls lined with decaying brick, overrun by creeping vines and mold. The stench of rot and mildew permeated the air, making it difficult to breathe. The only source of light came from a series of weak bulbs strung haphazardly across the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced menacingly on the walls. In the center of the room, a massive iron door loomed, covered in rust and heavy bolts. Its surface was adorned with cryptic symbols and numbers carved deep into the metal. But it was what lay in front of the door that seized the man's attention. A sprawling grid of floor tiles stretched from one end of the room to the other, each tile etched with various shapes, some triangles, some circles, others jagged and irregular. Several tiles had dark stains splattered across them, stains that the man couldn't help but recognize as blood. His stomach twisted in fear as he realized that stepping on the wrong tile would likely trigger something deadly. The layout was deliberate, a sadistic puzzle that would demand precision, logic, and perhaps even sacrifice. To the left of the grid was an old chalkboard, barely legible beneath layers of grime, with fragments of numbers and symbols scrawled across it. Some of the markings had been crossed out, while others were underlined, as if someone had tried and failed to decipher the correct pattern. The man's hands trembled as he studied the grid, his eyes darting between the symbols, searching for a pattern or clue. He knew he had no choice but to cross the tiles if he wanted to reach the door, but the threat of triggering a trap with every step was paralyzing. He glanced back toward the passage he had come from, knowing there was no turning back. The collar around his neck buzzed again, a warning that his time was limited, even if no visible countdown was present in this room. The faint ticking of gears could be heard somewhere above, signaling that the next test had already begun. Taking a deep breath, he placed one foot onto the nearest tile, choosing a circle etched with an arrow pointing forward. The tile sank slightly under his weight, and for a tense moment, nothing happened. Encouraged by the lack of immediate danger, he moved forward to the next tile, this one marked with a triangle. Again, the tile depressed slightly, but this time, a loud click echoed through the chamber. Panic surged through him as he froze in place, his eyes wide with terror. A section of the ceiling above shifted, releasing a rusted blade that swung down toward him with terrifying speed. He ducked just in time, the blade slicing through the air where his head had been only a second before. It smashed into the wall behind him, embedding itself deep into the brick. His breath came in ragged gasps as he realized just how close he'd come to being decapitated. The man knew he couldn't afford another mistake. He was playing a game of life and death, where each wrong step was a gamble with his own survival. His mind raced as he reconsidered the grid. The symbols weren't random. There had to be a pattern, a sequence hidden among the tiles. Perhaps the markings on the chalkboard were a key, but deciphering them while under this immense pressure felt impossible. Time blurred as he crouched low, squinting at the markings and trying to connect them to the symbols beneath his feet. He could feel the seconds slipping away, each one bringing him closer to another deadly trap. The only sound was his own shallow breathing, interrupted occasionally by the creak of rusted metal somewhere in the distance. Finally, he made a decision. He stepped onto another tile, this one a square with an intersecting line. The tile shifted, and he braced himself for another swinging blade or hidden spike. But instead, the iron door in the distance groaned as one of its many bolts slid loose with a metallic scrape. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. He was still far from the door, and there were dozens more tiles to navigate. With renewed focus, he carefully mapped out his path, each step an exercise in precision and calculation. He avoided the blood-stained tiles, his instincts warning him that they had already claimed lives. As he moved forward, the puzzle seemed to grow more complex. The symbols became more abstract, and the sequence less clear. Sweat ran down his back as the collar buzzed faintly, a reminder that his time was running out. He reached the halfway point, but his progress was slow, and doubt gnawed at him with each step. The chalkboard's markings provided some guidance, but the ambiguity of the symbols made it a constant guessing game. With every tile he pressed, he expected the worst, a trap door opening beneath him, poison darts shooting from the walls, or worse. But he had no choice but to push forward. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the final row of tiles just a few feet from the iron door. His heart pounded in his chest as he faced the last 3 tiles, each one bearing a different symbol, a cross, a spiral, and an eye. He hesitated, the choice paralyzing him. The wrong step here could erase all his progress, or worse, end his life entirely. The iron door loomed before him, silent and foreboding, a barrier to whatever lay beyond. The numbers etched into its surface seemed to mock him, as if they held the answer to the puzzle all along. The man squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to steady his breathing and block out the crushing pressure of time. He opened them and made his choice. He stepped onto the tile with the spiral symbol. It depressed beneath his weight, and for a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening clank, the remaining bolts on the iron door released, and it creaked open just enough for him to squeeze through. The man exhaled in shaky relief, adrenaline still surging through his veins as he crossed the threshold. But as he stepped into the darkness beyond, he realized the trials were far from over. A chill ran down his spine as he caught sight of what lay ahead. A deeper, darker maze of traps, challenges, and horrors designed to break him, both physically and mentally. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside a new nightmare.
The silence returned, more oppressive than ever. The faint ticking of unseen clocks echoed through the walls, a constant reminder that the game was still in motion and the worst was yet to come. Chapter 4. The Weight of Sacrifice. The iron door slammed shut behind him with a resounding finality, leaving the man in near total darkness. The heavy, oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. The air was colder here, dense with a sickly sweet odor that made him gag. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering in from narrow cracks along the ceiling, revealing a narrow corridor stretching out before him. The corridor's walls were lined with old, rusted pipes, hissing and groaning as they leaked foul-smelling steam. Beneath his feet, the floor was slick with some kind of greasy substance, making each step treacherous. The walls were covered in grime, with patches of peeling paint that revealed the cracked concrete beneath. A low, rhythmic hum vibrated through the floor, pulsing like the heartbeat of the twisted environment around him. As he moved cautiously forward, the corridor began to widen, revealing a larger room ahead. The space was dimly lit by a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling, casting long shadows that flickered ominously. In the center of the room, a heavy iron platform stood raised slightly above the floor, held up by thick metal chains that hung from the ceiling. It looked like a scale, a massive, industrial contraption designed to measure weight. On one side of the platform lay a pile of old, rusted metal scraps, bolts, and chains, while the other side was empty, suspended in the air, waiting for something or someone to balance it out. The man's eyes were drawn to a series of levers mounted on a control panel beside the platform. Each lever was labeled with faded numbers, and beneath them were gauges that monitored weight and pressure. The setup was crude but precise, every detail carefully constructed to serve a specific purpose. His heart sank as he realized what the challenge entailed. He would have to balance the scale to move forward, but the cost would likely be more than just material weight. He approached the control panel, examining the levers and gauges. As he did, a new sound filled the room, a faint, rhythmic ticking that grew louder as he studied the platform. He followed the sound to a small clock embedded in the wall, its hands moving at a steady pace. This clock was different from the others. Instead of counting down from minutes or seconds, it seemed to be tracking something else entirely: pressure, tension, and the equilibrium of the room. A sudden grinding noise echoed from above, drawing his attention upward. Suspended from the ceiling by a complex network of pulleys was a large iron cage, swaying gently as it hung over the platform. The cage was empty, but it was obvious that it played a critical role in the challenge ahead. The cage was connected to the platform by a series of chains and gears, which seemed to suggest that balancing the scale would also determine whether the cage would be lowered, or perhaps dropped violently, depending on his actions. The man's mind raced as he pieced together the mechanics of the room. To proceed, he would need to balance the platform by either adding more weight to the empty side or removing weight from the loaded side. But the rusted metal scraps piled onto the platform were too heavy for him to lift alone. The only way to achieve balance would be to use himself as the counterweight, a prospect that sent chills down his spine. His gaze fell back on the control panel, where a small gauge displayed a number, 1,000 pounds. The platform was calibrated to this weight, and any deviation would trigger a reaction, potentially activating one of the many traps hidden in the room. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was razor-thin. He knew what he had to do. With no other options, he stepped onto the empty side of the platform, feeling the cold metal shift beneath his weight. The chains creaked and groaned, the platform lowering slightly as he settled onto it. The gauges on the control panel flickered, adjusting to the change, but the needle remained stubbornly below the required weight. It wasn't enough. He would have to add more weight, either by finding something else in the room or sacrificing more of himself. A quick scan of the room revealed nothing useful, just the rusted metal scraps, old tools, and debris. He couldn't afford to waste time searching for something that might not even be there. The collar around his neck buzzed faintly again, a reminder that the clock was always ticking, that his time was slipping away. The man's breath hitched as he realized what he had to do next. The rusty tools scattered on the floor, a hammer, a dull saw, a pair of pliers, weren't just there for show. They were meant for him to use, to strip away whatever weight he could from his own body. The horror of it all made his stomach turn, but he knew there was no other way to balance the scale. The twisted logic behind this trial was clear. To move forward, he would have to sacrifice part of himself, literally. With trembling hands, he picked up the saw, its blade dull and jagged from years of disuse. The sight of it sent waves of nausea through him, but the reality of the situation left no room for hesitation. His eyes darted back to the control panel, watching the gauge as the needle wavered just below the target. He swallowed hard, his heart racing as he braced himself for the unimaginable. The first cut was shallow, a test of his resolve. Pain seared through him, white-hot and all-consuming, as he pressed the saw deeper into his flesh. Blood flowed freely, staining the metal platform beneath him as he continued, the jagged teeth tearing through skin and muscle. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to stop, but he forced himself to continue, his mind locked in a battle between survival and agony. Time became a blur, the ticking of the clock drowned out by the pounding in his ears. Sweat poured down his face as he gritted his teeth against the pain, his vision swimming with tears and exhaustion. The weight of his own sacrifice slowly began to tip the balance, the platform groaning as it shifted under the new load. Finally, with one last effort, the gauge's needle clicked into place, aligning perfectly with the target. The platform leveled out, the grinding of gears signaling that the mechanism had accepted the weight. The iron cage above creaked and lowered gently to the ground, opening the way forward. The man collapsed onto the platform, his body trembling from blood loss and shock. His vision blurred as he stared at the cage, the door now wide open, revealing a dark passage beyond. He knew he couldn't afford to rest, no matter how much his body screamed for relief. The room was still, the challenge complete, but the game was far from over. With great effort, he dragged himself off the platform, leaving behind a trail of blood. Every step was agony, his body weakened by the pain and the gruesome self-inflicted wound. But he forced himself onward, crawling toward the open cage, knowing that whatever awaited him next would be even more harrowing. As he crossed the threshold into the dark passage, the iron door slammed shut behind him, sealing off the room and erasing any trace of his struggle. The passage descended steeply, leading him further into the depths of this nightmarish labyrinth. He had passed another test, but the cost was more than just physical. It was a piece of his soul, stripped away by the horrors he had endured. In the darkness ahead, faint echoes of grinding metal and distant, rhythmic ticking filled the air, reminding him that the game was far from over. The deeper he ventured, the more twisted the trials would become. And with each step, the weight of sacrifice would grow heavier, threatening to break him completely. Chapter 5. The Pit of Shadows. The passage narrowed into a claustrophobic tunnel, walls pressing close on either side as the man crawled forward. The wound on his arm throbbed, pulsing with every heartbeat. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage he had torn from his shirt, leaving a dark trail behind him. His body was weakening from exhaustion and blood loss, but the fear of what lay behind drove him deeper into the darkness. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of decay and something fouler, like burnt flesh and oil. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber. The man collapsed to his knees at the entrance, panting heavily. The chamber was shrouded in a thick mist, curling along the floor and swirling around the jagged stone pillars that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Above, the ceiling was lost in darkness, with only faint glimmers of light from unseen sources casting eerie reflections off the mist. The room was deathly silent, except for the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. He slowly rose to his feet, his legs trembling with fatigue, and surveyed the space. The chamber was massive, far larger than any of the previous rooms, and unlike before, there were no visible traps or puzzles. Instead, the center of the room was dominated by a vast circular pit. The edge of the pit was lined with rusted spikes and barbed wire, making it clear that there was no escape if one were to fall in. The mist seemed to rise from within the pit, thickening as it drifted upward, obscuring whatever lay at the bottom. The man edged closer to the pit, drawn by a sick sense of curiosity. Peering over the side, he could just make out movement far below, a writhing, churning mass of something alive. It wasn't human. It was a seething, pulsating horror, a tangle of limbs, eyes, and twisted forms that defied understanding. The sight made bile rise in his throat, and he recoiled, nearly losing his balance on the slippery stone. A shudder ran through him as he backed away from the pit, but there was nowhere else to go. The walls of the chamber were sheer, smooth stone, offering no footholds or exits. The only way forward was across the pit, which stretched nearly the entire width of the room. Suspended above the pit, barely visible through the mist, was a narrow bridge made of iron bars, some rusted through and others missing entirely. The bridge was thin and unstable, swaying slightly even in the still air. Crossing it would be a test of nerve and balance, with a single misstep plunging him into the abyss below. But it wasn't just the bridge that worried him. Directly across from where he stood was a large metal door, covered in chains and heavy locks. Next to the door was a lever, but this time it wasn't as simple as pulling it and moving on. Connected to the lever was a series of gears and weights that ran along the bridge. The man realized with growing dread that to open the door, he would have to engage the lever first, but doing so would trigger something that would make crossing the bridge even more dangerous. There was no time to dwell on the implications. He was aware of the ticking clock that he could no longer see, the countdown that was always present, lurking in the background. He knew that whatever force was behind this twisted game had no mercy, and delaying meant facing a fate worse than death. With no other options, he took a deep breath and stepped cautiously onto the bridge. The iron bars creaked under his weight, sending vibrations rippling through the structure. He moved slowly, testing each step before shifting his full weight forward. The bridge wobbled precariously, and he instinctively gripped the chains hanging from above for balance. The bars beneath his feet were cold and slick with moisture, some bending slightly as he stepped on them. Every step felt like a gamble, the threat of falling ever present as the mist swirled beneath him, hiding the pit from view, but not from his imagination. About halfway across, the bridge groaned loudly, the chains clattering as one of the rusted bars snapped under his foot. He quickly shifted his weight, his heart racing as he clung desperately to the chains to avoid plummeting into the darkness. The near miss left his nerves frayed, and he found himself trembling with fear. But he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping now would only make it worse. When he finally reached the other side, he felt a brief surge of relief, but it quickly evaporated as he faced the lever. He studied the gears connected to it, trying to decipher what would happen once he pulled it. The mechanism seemed designed to tighten the chains supporting the bridge, likely causing sections to snap or collapse entirely. He had to pull the lever and then make it back across the bridge before it gave way beneath him. Gritting his teeth, he yanked the lever downward. A loud clink echoed through the chamber as the gears engaged, and the entire bridge jolted violently. The chains began to creak and groan under the increased tension, and several bars started bending or snapping, sending bits of rust and metal falling into the pit below. He didn't wait to see how long the bridge would hold. He turned and sprinted back across, his footsteps pounding against the bars in a desperate rhythm. The bridge swayed wildly with each step, the chains whipping back and forth as more bars gave way. The mist below seemed to rise higher, as if whatever was lurking in the pit sensed his fear, waiting for him to fall. He leaped over missing sections of the bridge, narrowly avoiding gaps where the bars had fallen away. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like they were made of lead, but adrenaline pushed him forward, the terror of falling driving him to move faster. With one final leap, he threw himself onto solid ground, just as the bridge collapsed entirely behind him. The sound of snapping chains and crashing metal filled the chamber as the remains of the bridge tumbled into the pit, swallowed by the darkness below. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He had survived, but only by a hair's breadth. The metal door across the pit began to unlock, the chains uncoiling and retracting into the walls. The gears continued to turn, releasing the final bolts that held the door shut. With a loud groan, the door slowly creaked open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. It was darker than anything he had encountered so far, a void that seemed to absorb the faint light around it. Dragging himself to his feet, the man limped toward the open door, his entire body protesting every movement. The wound on his arm throbbed mercilessly, and his limbs felt heavy, almost as if they were being pulled downward by some invisible force. But he knew he couldn't stop, not now. He had come too far, endured too much to give in to the pain. As he crossed the threshold into the passage, the metal door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in total darkness. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and he could feel the walls closing in around him as he moved deeper into the void. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, making every step uncertain and unsteady. There was no sound now, no ticking clock, no grinding gears, only the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The man's heartbeat was the only thing he could hear, a constant reminder that he was still alive, still trapped in this nightmare.
But somewhere deep in the darkness ahead, a faint light flickered. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a glimmer of hope, or perhaps a warning of the next trial to come. He had no choice but to follow it, to keep moving forward even as every instinct screamed at him to turn back. With one last glance over his shoulder, he left the pit behind, plunging into the unknown once more. Chapter 6. The Walls That Close In. The passage ahead narrowed into a suffocating crawl space, forcing the man to drop onto his hands and knees. The ground was cold and rough, scraping against his skin as he crawled forward. The dim light ahead flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls that seemed to inch closer with every movement. The air was stale, heavy with dust and the metallic scent of old blood. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing echoing off the stone. Time lost its meaning in the dark. Each stretch of the tunnel felt like an eternity, the claustrophobic space pressing in on all sides. The deeper he crawled, the more the tunnel seemed to close in, the walls narrowing to the point where his shoulders scraped against the jagged stone. The light ahead wavered, almost mocking him with its faint promise of escape. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, his limbs trembling from fatigue. Blood still oozed from the wound on his arm, leaving a dark trail behind him. Suddenly, the tunnel began to shift, a low rumbling reverberating through the stone. The man froze, panic tightening its grip on him as the walls shuddered. Dust rained down from above, and the ground beneath him vibrated. Then, without warning, the walls began to move, slowly at first. Then with increasing speed, the stone walls started to slide inward, grinding against the floor with a deafening roar. The tunnel was collapsing, squeezing the narrow space even tighter. The man's instincts took over as he scrambled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The light ahead grew brighter as the walls closed in, leaving him less and less room to maneuver. The stone scraped against his skin, tearing through his clothes and drawing blood as he clawed his way through the tunnel. Each movement was a desperate struggle against the encroaching walls, which groaned and creaked with a relentless pressure. There was no turning back. The only way out was forward, toward the ever-dimming light. The rumbling grew louder, filling the tunnel with a cacophony of grinding stone and the echo of his own panicked breaths. He could feel the walls brushing against his ribs, the space narrowing to the point where every inch felt like a battle for survival. The light ahead flickered violently, threatening to extinguish as the man pushed himself to the limit. His hands were raw, bloodied from scraping against the stone, and his muscles screamed in protest. He could barely breathe, each inhale shallow and painful as the tunnel constricted further. The sensation of being buried alive was overwhelming, the crushing weight of the stone pressing in on his mind as much as his body. But giving in to despair wasn't an option. He gritted his teeth and forced himself onward, inching through the shrinking gap. The tunnel's exit was so close now, just a few more feet, but the walls were closing faster, threatening to seal him inside. The light ahead flared one last time, illuminating a small chamber just beyond the end of the tunnel. It was a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness, a promise that escape was within reach. With a final surge of strength, the man hurled himself forward, squeezing through the last tight stretch of the tunnel just as the walls clamped shut behind him. He tumbled into the chamber, landing hard on the cold stone floor. The sound of the walls slamming together echoed like thunder, the shockwave reverberating through the small room. Dust and debris filled the air, stinging his eyes and clogging his throat. The man lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, every nerve alight with the terror of what he had just escaped. The small chamber was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were smooth, carved from the same cold stone as the rest of the labyrinth, but this room had a strange, almost sterile quality to it. There was no grime or rust here. Everything was unervingly clean, the surfaces polished and reflective in the faint light. As he regained his composure, the man noticed something in the center of the room. A metal table stood there, bolted to the floor, with restraints built into its surface. The table's surface gleamed under the light, its cold, surgical appearance sending a chill down his spine. Around the room, various tools were laid out neatly on a small tray, blades, clamps, and other instruments designed for pain and precision. Everything was meticulously arranged, as if waiting for an experiment to begin. But it wasn't the tools or the table that drew his attention. It was the writing on the wall behind them. Scrawled in thick, black letters were instructions, commands etched into the stone. The man's blood ran cold as he read the message. The choice is yours. Surrender the pain or face oblivion. He knew what it meant. The table wasn't just a trap. It was a test, another twisted game designed to break him. The restraints on the table were meant for him, and the tools were there for him to use on himself. The writing on the wall was clear. He could either endure more agony by willingly subjecting himself to whatever tortures awaited on the table, or face an even worse fate if he refused. The man's legs nearly gave out as the weight of the decision bore down on him. He was already broken, his body battered and weakened, his mind frayed from the relentless torment. But the alternative was unthinkable. If he didn't comply, the walls would close in again, sealing him in this chamber to die a slow, agonizing death. There was no way out, only a choice between two evils. His eyes darted between the tools on the tray, each one gleaming with malicious intent, and the restraints on the table. He could almost hear the ticking clock again, the sound of time running out as he wrestled with the impossible decision. His mind spiraled into a haze of fear and desperation, searching for an answer, a way to survive without having to face the horrors laid out before him. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping this trial. The design was perfect in its cruelty, leaving him no room to maneuver, no clever tricks to outwit the unseen force behind it all. He was trapped in a web of choices that only led to more suffering. With trembling hands, the man reached for the restraints, his resolve crumbling as the full weight of his situation settled in. The cold metal snapped shut around his wrists, locking him in place on the table. The tools lay within arm's reach, waiting for him to begin the torment. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow as he stared at the instruments of pain. The choice had been made, but the nightmare was far from over. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the walls growing darker as the light flickered overhead. He knew that whatever lay beyond this trial would be even worse. The game was designed to break him piece by piece, to strip away his humanity until all that was left was a shattered, hollow shell. But he had to keep going. He had to survive, even if it meant sacrificing what little of himself remained. With a final, shuddering breath, he reached for the first tool. Chapter 7. The Mirror of Regret. The man emerged from the chamber, bloodied and barely able to stand, his mind reeling from the self-inflicted wounds. His arms throbbed with the fresh cuts he had carved into them, a testament to the nightmarish choice he had been forced to make. Every step was agony, each movement sending sharp, searing pain through his body. But as broken as he was, the will to survive burned on. The twisted game had not beaten him yet. The corridor ahead was long and narrow, the walls lined with cracked tiles that reflected dim, ghostly light. The flickering bulbs overhead cast uneven shadows, making the walls seem to warp and shift as he staggered forward. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, mingling with the coppery tang of his own blood. His vision blurred as exhaustion dragged him down, but he forced himself onward. Stopping now would mean surrendering to the nightmare that pursued him. The passage ended abruptly at a large iron door, rusted and corroded around the edges. It stood ominously silent, as if waiting for him. There was no visible lock or handle, only a keyhole set into the center of the door. Next to it, a small alcove held a single object, a tarnished silver key. The simplicity of it all sent a shiver down his spine. There was no puzzle to solve, no immediate danger, just a key waiting to be used. But experience had taught him that nothing in this place was ever as straightforward as it seemed. He hesitated before reaching for the key, every nerve on edge as he tried to anticipate the trap. But no matter how carefully he examined the surroundings, there was nothing obvious to suggest what would happen once he used the key. The only thing he knew for certain was that the door was his only way forward. With no other options, he gritted his teeth and grabbed the key, feeling its cold, metallic weight in his hand. The moment he touched it, the walls trembled slightly, as if responding to his decision. He slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a heavy finality, and the iron door creaked open, revealing a large, darkened room beyond. The man stepped inside cautiously, scanning the space for any immediate threats. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, trapping him in darkness. For a moment, he was engulfed in pitch-black silence, the only sound his ragged breathing echoing in the emptiness. Then, The lights flared to life, blindingly bright. The room was vast, its walls lined with cracked mirrors of varying sizes. Some were full-length, others small and round, but all of them were dirty and smeared with grime, distorting the reflections within. The man's own image stared back at him from every angle, fractured and ghostly. His bloodied, hollow-eyed face was repeated 100 times over, creating a nightmarish maze of reflections that disoriented him. At the center of the room stood a single pedestal, atop which lay an intricately carved wooden box. The box was open, revealing a gleaming blade inside, a razor-sharp scalpel glinting in the harsh light. The man's reflection was visible in the blade, twisted and warped by the polished metal. Surrounding the pedestal were more mirrors, angled in such a way that no matter where he moved, he couldn't escape seeing himself from all sides. It was as if the room itself was designed to trap him within his own image, forcing him to confront the horrors etched into his flesh. The man's eyes were drawn back to the scalpel. He didn't need any instructions to understand what was expected of him. The twisted logic of the place had become painfully clear. The key to escape was tied to his own suffering. The only way out would be to use the blade on himself once more, to carve away another piece of his humanity in exchange for survival. His reflection multiplied around him, each image staring with dead, empty eyes. The mirrors distorted his face into grotesque versions of himself. Faces twisted in agony, mocking grins, and hollow stares that seemed to taunt him. Every step toward the pedestal was mirrored infinitely, the reflections moving in unison like some macabre dance. The more he stared at them, the more he felt his sanity fraying, as if the countless images were trying to pull him into their broken reality. He reached the pedestal and took the scalpel in his trembling hand. The metal was cold against his skin, its weight deceptively light. He stared at the blade, then at the reflections that surrounded him. Each version of himself seemed to be waiting, watching in silent judgment as he hesitated. It wasn't just pain he feared. It was the knowledge that each cut would take him one step closer to losing himself entirely, to becoming just another reflection in this twisted hall of mirrors. But there was no time for doubt. The room was waiting for him to act, the silence pressing in like a vice. The ticking clock in his mind urged him forward, reminding him that hesitation would only lead to a worse fate. With a deep breath, he steeled himself and made the cut. Pain seared through him as the blade bit into his flesh, drawing a line of crimson across his chest. The mirrors around him flared with light, each one reflecting the moment in excruciating detail. The man's face twisted in agony, his reflection captured in countless angles, creating a kaleidoscope of suffering. The blood trickled down his skin, staining the floor as the room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, feeding off his torment. But as the blood flowed, something strange happened. The mirrors began to shift, the reflections blurring and merging into one another. The distorted images melted together, forming a single, unified reflection directly ahead of him. It was no longer fractured or twisted. It was a clear, perfect image of himself, staring back with cold, unblinking eyes. But there was something wrong, something off about the reflection. It wasn't mirroring his movements anymore. It stood still, watching him with a look of cold indifference. The man stumbled back, clutching his bleeding chest as the reflection stepped forward, breaking free of the mirror. It wasn't just an image anymore. It was a perfect doppelganger, identical in every way except for the expression on its face. Where the man was filled with fear and desperation, the doppelganger was calm, almost serene, as if it was in control of the situation. It tilted its head slightly, as if considering him, before raising its hand. The man's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The reflection was taking his place, crossing the line between reality and illusion. He was being replaced, pushed out of his own reality and into the world of the mirrors. The doppelganger took a step closer, and the mirrors around them cracked, spiderwebs of fractures spreading across the glass. Each crack was accompanied by a sharp, ringing sound like the tolling of a bell. Panicking, the man turned to flee, but the walls of mirrors closed in around him, trapping him in a shrinking circle of glass. His own reflection multiplied again, but this time it was wrong. Warped, twisted versions of himself that snarled and leered from the shattered glass. The doppelganger moved with terrifying precision, closing the distance with each step. There was no escape, no way to outrun what was now an inevitable fate. In a last, desperate act, the man raised the scalpel and drove it into his own reflection, shattering the mirror in front of him. Glass exploded outward in a rain of sharp fragments, cutting into his skin as the room was plunged into darkness. The reflections vanished, leaving only the sound of shattering glass echoing in the void. For a moment, there was silence, complete and utter stillness, as if the room itself had ceased to exist. Then, a single light flickered on, revealing the broken remains of the mirror. The man stood alone in the darkness, blood dripping from his wounds, his chest heaving with exhaustion. But something was different. He looked down at his hands, at the reflection in the shards of glass at his feet. The face staring back at him was no longer his own. It was the face of the doppelganger, calm, serene, and utterly devoid of emotion. He was the reflection now, trapped in the shattered remnants of his own mind, while the doppelganger, his true self, walked free. The door at the far end of the room creaked open, revealing the next corridor. The doppelganger calmly stepped forward, leaving the man behind, lost in the maze of broken mirrors. Chapter 8: The Endless Descent. The corridor beyond the shattered mirrors was a narrow, spiral staircase, winding down into what seemed like an abyss. The steps were uneven, worn smooth by countless others who had been forced down this path before. The walls were damp and cold to the touch, slick with moisture that trickled down in slow, creeping rivulets. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a faint, musty odor that clung to the man's senses like decay. As he descended, the light from above grew dimmer until it was swallowed by the darkness. The only illumination came from faint, flickering sconces mounted at irregular intervals on the walls, casting sickly yellow light that did little to push back the shadows. The man's breath formed white clouds in the chill air, his steps echoing in the vast emptiness below. It felt as if he was descending into the very heart of a labyrinth, where the darkness held secrets too terrible to be revealed. The stairs seemed endless. With every turn, the passage grew narrower and steeper, until the man was practically sliding down with each step. His legs burned from the strain, and his mind wavered on the edge of exhaustion, teetering between desperation and surrender. Time became a blur. Each minute stretched into an eternity as he spiraled deeper into the void. The walls groaned occasionally, as if alive, shifting just enough to make the descent even more treacherous. Finally, the stairs ended, spilling the man out into a vast, echoing chamber. The ceiling was so high it was lost in darkness, while the walls were lined with pillars that stretched upward like ancient sentinels. The chamber was filled with a dense mist that clung to the floor, swirling lazily around his ankles. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, each drop echoing like a ticking clock in the vast emptiness. At the center of the chamber stood a towering monolith, carved from smooth, black stone. The surface of the stone was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the man's gaunt, hollow-eyed face as he approached. The reflection wavered in the mist, distorted by the cold light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The monolith was covered in strange, intricate carvings, symbols that pulsed faintly with a sickly green glow. They twisted and coiled across the stone in patterns that hurt the eyes if stared at too long, their meaning just beyond comprehension. The man felt a chill crawl down his spine as he drew closer. The symbols weren't just carvings. They were alive, writhing like worms beneath the surface of the stone. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and rot, as if the chamber was a tomb long forgotten. He could feel the weight of countless souls pressing in on him, whispers barely audible at the edges of his consciousness. The monolith exuded a presence, something ancient and malevolent, waiting patiently for him to take the next step. At the base of the monolith lay a single, rusted iron key. The key was large, its teeth jagged and uneven, as if it had been crudely forged by hands that cared little for precision. The key seemed out of place amid the dark grandeur of the chamber, but the man knew it held significance. It was another piece of the puzzle, another trial to be endured in this hellish game. But it wasn't the key that held his attention, it was what lay beyond it. Directly behind the monolith was a massive stone door, covered in chains and secured with heavy locks. The door was etched with the same writhing symbols as the monolith, and from its edges seeped a faint, pulsating red light. It was clear that the key was meant to unlock one of the locks on the door, but there were at least a dozen more, each requiring a different key. The man's heart sank as the realization dawned on him. This was no simple task. The door represented the culmination of every trial, every torment he had endured thus far. Each key would be a piece of his suffering, extracted through pain and sacrifice. He would have to find each one, each trial pushing him further toward the edge of madness. The labyrinth's design was perfect in its cruelty. It was designed not just to test his will to survive, but to strip him of his very soul in the process. As he reached down to pick up the key, the chamber rumbled. The sound was deep and resonant, like the growl of some ancient beast awakening from slumber. The monolith's carvings flared with a sickly green light, pulsating in rhythm with the tremors. The mist thickened, swirling upward like ghostly tendrils that wrapped around the man's legs. The air grew colder still, and the whispers became louder, no longer at the edge of his consciousness, but right in his ear, murmuring incomprehensible words that gnawed at his sanity. Then the floor began to shift. The tiles beneath his feet slid apart, revealing dark, yawning chasms that stretched downward into an abyss. The man barely managed to leap aside as one of the gaps widened, threatening to swallow him whole. The chamber was rearranging itself, the pillars twisting and warping as the monolith's light pulsed faster. What had once been a stable floor was now a deadly maze of collapsing tiles and hidden pitfalls. With no time to think, the man clutched the key and began to move. He navigated the shifting floor with desperate agility, dodging falling debris and leaping over the widening gaps. The chamber's dimensions seemed to change with every step, the walls closing in and the ceiling dropping lower, as if the room itself was alive, trying to crush him. The red light, seeping from the stone door, flickered like a heartbeat, drawing him closer even as the labyrinth fought to hold him back. Sweat mingled with blood as the man pushed himself to the limit. His muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned with every breath, but he could not afford to stop. The whispers had become a chorus of mocking voices, taunting him, urging him to give up, to let the abyss claim him. But he refused to yield. He had come too far, suffered too much. Whatever lay behind that door held the answers, or at least an end to this torment. After what felt like an eternity, the man reached the door. The red light blazed with an intensity that hurt his eyes, casting his shadow across the writhing symbols. He fumbled with the key, hands slick with sweat, and shoved it into the nearest lock. It resisted at first, as if the door itself was reluctant to let him proceed, but with a twist, the key turned, and the lock clattered open. 1 down, 11 to go. The chains rattled ominously as the first lock fell away, but the door remained firmly shut. The man could feel the malevolence seeping from the cracks, a darkness that threatened to consume him if he lingered too long. But he had no choice. This was his path, the only way forward. He turned away from the door, the monolith's green glow pulsing rhythmically behind him, and prepared himself for the next trial. But as he took a step back toward the staircase, the chamber shifted again. The floor convulsed violently, sending him sprawling to the ground. The mist thickened, rising to his waist, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch, swirling around him like a storm. The walls groaned and bent inward, pressing in from all sides. It was as if the labyrinth was rejecting him, trying to squeeze him out like a foreign object. Suddenly, the mist coalesced into a figure, a vague, shadowy shape that hovered in the center of the chamber. It was featureless, its form constantly shifting, but it radiated a palpable sense of dread. The man's blood ran cold as the figure glided toward him, its presence heavy with the weight of untold suffering. It was an embodiment of the labyrinth's malice, a specter born from the agony of all who had been trapped here before him. The man's instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the floor was collapsing, and the specter loomed closer, its shapeless mass undulating with silent menace. There was no escape, no salvation. The labyrinth had finally caught up to him, and all that remained was the darkness. In that moment, the man made a decision. He would not flee. He would face whatever horror awaited him head-on. Clutching the remaining keys tight, he stood his ground as the specter closed in. His reflection flickered in the monolith's surface, distorted and broken, but it was still his. If this was the end, he would face it on his terms. But the specter did not strike. Instead, it stopped just inches away, its amorphous shape twisting and churning. It was waiting, testing him. The man stared into its shifting void, searching for any sign of what it wanted. The whispers grew louder, deafening, until they formed a single, coherent word. Choose. The word reverberated in his mind like a command. The trials were not just about survival. They were about choice. The labyrinth was more than just a series of tortures. It was a crucible designed to force him to confront the darkest parts of himself. Every decision, every sacrifice, was a piece of a puzzle that only he could solve. With that realization, the specter dissipated, the mist receding into the floor. The chamber's walls returned to their original state, the pillars straightening as the floor stabilized. The man was left standing alone, the weight of the next trial pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. The labyrinth had shown mercy, but only to reveal that the true horrors were yet to come. He knew now that each key would require a choice, a test not of his strength, but of his soul. And with each choice, a piece of him would be lost, sacrificed to unlock the door to freedom. How much of himself would remain by the time he found the final key? With weary resolve, the man turned away from the monolith and began his search for the next key. The labyrinth was vast, and the trials ahead promised only more suffering. But he would press on, because to do otherwise would mean surrendering to the darkness that sought to claim him. The endless descent was far from over. Chapter 9. The Chamber of Echoes. Emerging from the dark spiral staircase, the man found himself in another vast chamber. This one was starkly different from the previous rooms. A cavernous space with a high, vaulted ceiling, lost in shadow. The floor was a patchwork of uneven, ancient stone tiles, their surface worn smooth by the passage of time. The air was heavy and still, thick with a musty odor that hinted at long-forgotten secrets. Scattered throughout the chamber were numerous metal cages, their bars rusted and corroded. The cages were of varying sizes, from tiny enclosures barely big enough to hold a human body to larger ones that could contain several people. Each cage was empty, but the sense of confinement was palpable. The man could almost feel the weight of the suffering that had once been trapped within these iron confines. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate pedestal. Upon it rested a peculiar contraption, an old-fashioned phonograph, its brass horn glinting in the faint, eerie light that filtered through the room. Beside it lay a stack of black vinyl records, their surfaces blank and unmarked. The phonograph was an anachronism, out of place in this grim setting, but it exuded an aura of significance. As the man approached the pedestal, a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. It was as if the very walls were vibrating, amplifying a low-frequency sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The phonograph's horn seemed to pulse with the vibrations, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and the man could feel it in his bones. He reached for one of the records and carefully placed it onto the turntable. The needle descended, and the phonograph crackled to life, emitting a series of harsh mechanical noises. The sound was not music, but an unsettling cacophony of clicks, whirs, and hisses. It was as if the phonograph was struggling to produce something coherent, but the result was a distorted, alien noise. As the phonograph played, the chamber began to change. The metal cages seemed to shift and sway, their bars rattling in rhythm with the erratic sounds. The tiles on the floor began to glow faintly, casting long, undulating shadows that moved with a life of their own. The man's reflection danced across the walls, fragmented and multiplied by the shifting shadows. The hum grew louder, resonating through the chamber like a powerful, invisible force. The phonograph sound was joined by a strange, eerie whisper, soft and sibilant, yet unmistakably sinister. The whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls, echoing around the man in a disorienting pattern. The sound was disorienting, a relentless assault on his senses that made it difficult to think clearly. The phonograph's horn seemed to grow hotter with each passing moment, the metal heating up until it was almost unbearable to touch. The man's hands were scorched as he adjusted the needle, trying to find a different record, something that might make sense of the chaos. But each record he played only intensified the dissonance, the sound growing more frenzied and discordant. As the man struggled with the phonograph, the shadows on the walls began to coalesce into shapes. At first, they were indistinct forms, flickers of movement in the darkness. But soon, the shapes became more defined, resembling the silhouettes of people trapped within the cages. The figures appeared to be struggling, their motions mimicking the man's own efforts to escape the clamor of the phonograph. The shapes on the walls grew more detailed, their expressions clear now, faces twisted in silent screams of agony. The shadows moved with an eerie grace, their movements synchronized with the phonograph's discordant melody. It was as if the shadows were reenacting the suffering of those who had been trapped in the cages, their pain and despair now manifesting in the walls of the chamber. The man's breathing became erratic as the cacophony and the shifting shadows overwhelmed his senses. The chamber seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. The phonograph's relentless noise was deafening, and the whispers from the walls grew louder, forming a chorus of anguished voices that filled the air. In the midst of the chaos, the man noticed something unusual about the shadows. They were not just reflections, they were interacting with him, reacting to his movements. Whenever he moved, the shadows followed, mimicking his actions with eerie precision. The more he struggled, the more the shadows seemed to respond, amplifying his panic and confusion. Realizing that the shadows were somehow connected to the phonograph sound, the man began to experiment with the records. He played them in different sequences, trying to find a pattern or a rhythm that would break the cycle of torment. Each new record brought a different set of whispers, a new wave of shadows that danced across the walls in unsettling patterns. Desperation drove him to try every combination he could think of. The phonograph's needle skipped and sputtered, and the records became increasingly difficult to decipher. The shadows on the walls grew more frantic, their movements becoming erratic and chaotic. It was as if the chamber itself was reacting to his failure, intensifying the ordeal to push him further into madness. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the phonograph emitted a single, clear note, a deep, resonant tone that cut through the chaos. The sound was pure and untainted by the distortion that had plagued the previous records. As the note reverberated through the chamber, the shadows on the walls froze, their movements halting abruptly. The man's heart raced as he realized that the tone had somehow quieted the whispers and stilled the shadows. The chamber was no longer shifting or closing in. The metal cages and the phonograph remained motionless. The only sound was the lingering resonance of the note, echoing softly in the stillness. With a final, weary effort, the man approached the pedestal again. The phonograph had stopped playing, but the final record remained on the turntable. The note continued to hum gently, a soothing sound that contrasted sharply with the earlier cacophony. The man carefully removed the record and placed it aside, taking a moment to catch his breath. As the silence settled, the man's attention was drawn to the metal cages. A closer examination revealed that some of the cages had locks, heavy, rusted mechanisms that seemed to be missing their keys. The man realized that the records and the phonograph were not just a distraction. They were part of the puzzle, a means to unlock the cages and reveal what lay hidden inside. He approached the nearest cage, its lock rusty and corroded. With trembling hands, he tried to force it open, but it resisted. The lock was stubborn, and the man's strength was waning. He needed to find the missing keys, scattered somewhere within the chamber, to free the contents of the cages. The man began to search the room, moving among the metal cages and examining the floor. The tiles were uneven and cracked, and he found several hidden compartments beneath them. Each compartment held small, metallic objects, keys, tools, and fragments of broken glass. It was as if the chamber had been deliberately designed to hide its secrets. With each key he found, he returned to the cages and attempted to unlock them. The process was slow and painstaking, but gradually he managed to free a few of the smaller cages. Inside, he discovered various objects, worn clothing, scraps of paper, and odd trinkets that had been left behind. None of the items seemed to hold immediate significance, but each discovery added to the growing sense of unease. As he worked, the shadows on the walls began to shift again, although they were no longer as menacing. They seemed to follow his progress, their movements more subdued and less synchronized with the phonograph's earlier noise. The man could not shake the feeling that the shadows were observing him, their silent presence a constant reminder of the chamber's malevolent design. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of searching, the man found the last key. It was hidden in a compartment beneath one of the larger tiles, its surface engraved with strange symbols. He carried the key back to the final cage and inserted it into the lock. With a satisfying click, the lock sprang open, and the cage door swung wide. Inside the cage was a single object, a small, intricately carved wooden box. The box was adorned with ornate patterns and seemed almost out of place in the grim setting. The man carefully lifted the box out of the cage and examined it. It was light and unassuming, but its presence felt heavy with significance. As he opened the box, he found a single item inside, a delicate silver locket. The locket was beautifully crafted, its surface engraved with intricate designs that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. The man's fingers trembled as he opened the locket, revealing a small, folded piece of paper inside. He unfolded the paper and read the message scrawled on it, written in a neat, flowing script. The message was simple but chilling. The echoes of the past reveal the path to freedom. The man's eyes darted around the chamber, taking in the cages, the shadows, and the phonograph. The meaning of the message was clear. The chamber had been a test of his ability to decipher the echoes of his own suffering, and now he had to find a way to use that knowledge to move forward. With the locket in hand, he turned back to the pedestal and examined the phonograph once more. The hum of the final note still lingered in the air, and the shadows on the walls seemed to be shifting, forming patterns that hinted at a hidden pathway. The chamber had revealed its secrets, but it was up to him to understand and use them to escape. The man took a deep breath and prepared to face the next challenge. The echoes of the past had shown him a glimpse of the path to freedom, but the journey was far from over. The labyrinth awaited, and he would need all of his remaining strength and resolve to continue. With renewed determination, he stepped toward the shadows and the mysteries they held, ready to confront whatever lay ahead in the relentless pursuit of escape. Chapter 10: The Gallery of Guilt. The man's journey led him to a new chamber, a stark contrast to the previous ones. This room was vast, with high, arching ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. The walls were lined with heavy, dark drapes that obscured the surfaces, and the floor was covered in a deep, plush carpet that muffled his footsteps. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of old paper and dust. As he entered, the man noticed that the chamber was filled with an array of framed paintings and photographs, each displayed on ornate wooden easels. The artwork varied in style and subject: portraits of people, landscapes, and abstract compositions. Each frame was meticulously arranged, creating a gallery that seemed both grand and oppressive. The paintings and photographs were not ordinary. They depicted scenes of suffering, regret, and despair, moments of anguish frozen in time. One painting showed a family in mourning, their faces etched with sorrow. Another depicted a solitary figure surrounded by shadows, their expression one of utter desolation. Each image was rendered with haunting clarity, capturing the raw emotion of its subject. The man's gaze swept over the gallery, and he noticed that the paintings were arranged in a specific sequence, with each one leading to the next in a narrative that seemed to unfold as he moved through the room. The sequence was not immediately obvious, but the arrangement of the frames suggested a deliberate pattern, as if they were telling a story. As he approached the first painting, a soft, melancholic melody began to play. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder and more insistent as he moved closer. The melody was haunting, a mournful tune that seemed to resonate with the themes of the gallery. It came from hidden speakers embedded in the walls, their presence concealed by the drapes. The man studied the first painting, which depicted a figure standing at a crossroads, shrouded in mist. The figure's face was obscured, but their posture suggested indecision and uncertainty. The painting exuded a sense of being trapped between choices, a theme that resonated with the man's own experiences in the labyrinth. As he continued to the next painting, the melody shifted to a more discordant tone, reflecting the growing tension in the narrative. The second painting showed a scene of chaos, a crumbling cityscape with buildings on fire and people fleeing in panic. The image was filled with movement and turmoil, and the man could almost hear the screams and cries of those depicted. The progression through the gallery was unsettling. Each painting seemed to heighten the emotional intensity, moving from scenes of personal regret to broader, more abstract representations of suffering. The man felt as though he was being drawn into a vivid reenactment of his own guilt and anguish, the images mirroring his inner turmoil. One painting caught his eye, a portrait of a man shackled and bound, his face twisted in agony. The man in the portrait bore a striking resemblance to himself, which sent a shiver down his spine. The shackles were heavy and cruel, and the man's eyes seemed to plead for release. It was a vivid representation of his own feelings of entrapment and helplessness. As the man continued through the gallery, he noticed that the paintings were not just visual representations. They were interactive. Each frame was equipped with a hidden mechanism that triggered changes in the room. As he approached certain paintings, the gallery responded with subtle shifts in lighting, changes in the melody, or the appearance of new images. At one point, the lights dimmed, and the walls were illuminated by a soft, red glow. The paintings took on an ominous hue, their colors deepening and shifting. The melody became more discordant, a haunting, almost frenzied tune that filled the chamber with a sense of urgency. The man could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the gallery seemed to close in around him. He reached a painting that depicted a woman standing alone in a desolate landscape. Her face was hidden in shadow, but her posture suggested a profound sense of loss and isolation. As the man gazed at the painting, he noticed that the woman's eyes seemed to follow him, their expression one of silent accusation. The gallery's atmosphere grew more oppressive as he moved deeper into the room. The paintings became increasingly surreal and nightmarish, their content reflecting the darkest aspects of the human psyche. There were images of betrayal, torment, and despair, each more disturbing than the last. The melody reached a crescendo of haunting, dissonant notes, creating an atmosphere of palpable dread. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface framed by intricate carvings. The mirror was out of place amid the gallery's dark theme, but it seemed to draw the man's attention. The surface of the mirror was cloudy and distorted, making it difficult to see his reflection clearly. As he approached the mirror, the melody reached a final, mournful chord. The man's reflection slowly became clearer, and he saw that the image was not just his own. It was a composite of all the figures from the paintings, their faces merging with his own in a grotesque display of suffering and guilt. The man stared at the reflection, his own face a mixture of anguish and confusion. The mirror seemed to be a manifestation of the gallery's theme, a reflection of his own inner turmoil and guilt. The images of the paintings had coalesced into a single, haunting vision that captured the essence of his torment. The mirror's surface began to ripple, distorting the reflection and creating a shifting mosaic of images. The man saw scenes from his past, moments of regret, choices he had made, and the consequences of his actions. It was as if the mirror was forcing him to confront his own guilt and responsibility, holding up a mirror to his soul. In the midst of the shifting images, the man noticed a small, hidden compartment in the frame of the mirror. He reached for it and found a delicate, silver key nestled inside. The key was intricately designed, with a pattern that matched the carvings on the mirror. It was a symbol of hope, a means to unlock the next stage of the labyrinth. With the key in hand, the man turned away from the mirror and looked around the gallery once more. The paintings and photographs had lost their oppressive quality, their images fading into the shadows. The melody had quieted, leaving only the soft echo of the final chord. The man's journey through the gallery had been a trial of introspection and self-confrontation. The paintings and the mirror had revealed the depths of his guilt and anguish, forcing him to face the emotional consequences of his actions. The silver key was a tangible reminder of the trial's purpose, to unlock the next phase of the labyrinth and continue his journey. He took a deep breath and steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The gallery had been a test of his resolve and his ability to confront his own inner demons. With the key in hand, he prepared to leave the chamber and face whatever lay beyond. The man moved toward the exit, the gallery's oppressive atmosphere fading as he stepped into the next phase of the labyrinth. The journey was far from over, but he had gained a deeper understanding of himself and the trials that awaited him. The gallery had been a mirror to his soul, reflecting the shadows of his past and preparing him for the challenges yet to come. With renewed determination, he pressed on, ready to face the next trial and continue his relentless pursuit of escape. Chapter 11. The Pit of Reflection. The man exited the gallery of guilt and found himself in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls were smooth, cold concrete, and the floor was composed of irregular tiles that seemed to shift slightly with each step he took. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint echo of dripping water. The corridor stretched ahead, twisting into darkness, and the faint, flickering light from above created eerie, dancing shadows. As he walked, the corridor gradually widened, leading him into a large, circular chamber. The chamber was dominated by a deep pit in the center, its edges lined with smooth stone. The pit was covered by a heavy, grated metal cover, but the cover was partially ajar, allowing a glimpse into the darkness below. The man could hear the faint sound of water dripping from the depths, creating an unsettling rhythm that reverberated through the chamber. Surrounding the pit were various objects and artifacts: ancient scrolls, rusted tools, and dusty books. They were arranged haphazardly on wooden shelves and tables, as if abandoned in haste. The chamber was cluttered, and the objects seemed to be in a state of disarray, adding to the sense of foreboding. In one corner of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its frame covered in intricate carvings that depicted scenes of despair and struggle. The mirror's surface was clouded and dirty, making it difficult to see one's reflection clearly. The mirror was positioned to face the pit, as if it were an observer of the darkness below. The man approached the mirror and examined it closely. The carvings on the frame depicted scenes of conflict and anguish, their details rendered in a way that seemed to capture the essence of suffering. The mirror's surface was streaked with grime, but he could make out vague reflections of the room and the pit. Next to the mirror was a pedestal, upon which rested a small, wooden box. The box was intricately carved, with patterns that matched the mirror's frame. It was locked with a rusty, ancient keyhole. The man noticed that the silver key he had found in the gallery of guilt fit perfectly into the keyhole, and with a sense of apprehension, he turned the key and opened the box. Inside the box was a single object, a small, polished stone with an intricate design etched into its surface. The stone was smooth and cool to the touch, and it seemed to emit a faint, soothing glow. The man took the stone and examined it closely. The design on the stone resembled an abstract representation of the pit, with swirling patterns that seemed to move and shift when he looked at them. The man's attention was drawn back to the pit. He realized that the stone might hold significance in relation to the pit's darkness. He approached the edge of the pit and peered down into the abyss. The darkness below was impenetrable, and the sound of dripping water seemed to come from every direction. He could not see the bottom, but the pit seemed to stretch on indefinitely. He decided to lower the polished stone into the pit. He tied it to a length of rope and carefully lowered it through the opening. As the stone descended, the faint glow from its surface cast eerie reflections on the walls of the pit. The man watched intently, hoping for some indication of what lay below. After some time, the stone reached the bottom, but the darkness made it impossible to see what was down there. The man pulled the stone back up and examined it again. The glow had dimmed, and the stone seemed to be covered in a thin layer of dark, viscous substance. He wiped it clean and noticed that the intricate design on the stone had changed, revealing new patterns that were previously hidden. The changing design on the stone seemed to form a clue. The patterns resembled a map of the chamber, with specific symbols marking different locations. The man realized that the stone might be a key to understanding the chamber's layout and unlocking the next stage of his journey. He began to search the room for any corresponding symbols or markers that matched those on the stone. The search was meticulous, as he examined every object, every surface, and every detail in the chamber. The artifacts and scrolls on the shelves held cryptic symbols and ancient writing, but none seemed to match the patterns on the stone directly. In the process, he found a dusty, old book that seemed to have been overlooked. The book was bound in cracked leather, and its pages were yellowed with age. As he leafed through it, he discovered that the book contained a series of sketches and diagrams that seemed to relate to the chamber and its features. The drawings included representations of the pit, the mirror, and various symbols. The man compared the symbols in the book with those on the polished stone. It became clear that the book was a key to interpreting the stone's patterns. He identified several symbols that matched and realized that they indicated specific locations within the chamber. The symbols pointed to hidden compartments and secret passages that were not immediately visible. With this newfound knowledge, the man began to explore the chamber more thoroughly. He used the book and the stone to guide his search, uncovering hidden compartments behind the shelves and beneath the floor tiles. Each compartment revealed additional clues and artifacts, including old maps, strange tools, and pieces of ancient writing. One of the hidden compartments contained a set of metal rods and levers, along with a series of diagrams that explained their use. The diagrams depicted a mechanism that could be used to move the metal cover of the pit, potentially allowing access to whatever lay below. The man carefully examined the mechanism and understood how to operate it. He used the metal rods and levers to adjust the cover of the pit, carefully shifting it until it was fully removed. The darkness below was now accessible, and the man prepared himself to descend into the abyss. He found a sturdy rope and secured it to a nearby support beam. With a deep breath, he lowered himself into the pit. The descent was slow and arduous, with the darkness closing in around him. The man's hands were coated in a thick, dark substance, and the walls of the pit seemed to close in with every inch he descended. The faint sound of dripping water continued, adding to the sense of isolation and dread. Finally, he reached the bottom of the pit. The darkness was almost absolute, but he could make out the faint outlines of objects and structures. He illuminated the area with a small, portable light source he had found in one of the hidden compartments. The light revealed a small chamber at the bottom of the pit, filled with old crates and barrels. The man explored the chamber, discovering various items: old tools, fragments of broken artifacts, and scraps of parchment. Among the items, he found a small, intricately carved chest. The chest was adorned with symbols that matched those on the polished stone. It was locked with a complex mechanism, but he realized that the stone might be the key. He carefully aligned the stone with the chest lock and used its patterns to guide his actions. With a series of precise movements, he managed to unlock the chest. Inside, he found a set of old, dusty documents in a small, ornate box. The documents contained detailed instructions and maps that seemed to outline the next phase of the labyrinth. The small box was adorned with intricate carvings and a series of symbols. The man opened the box and found a delicate, silver pendant with a single gemstone. The gemstone glowed softly, casting a faint light in the dark chamber. The pendant was inscribed with symbols that matched those on the polished stone and the documents. With the pendant in hand and the documents as his guide, the man prepared to leave the pit. He ascended the rope and emerged back into the chamber above. The pit's cover was replaced, and the chamber's atmosphere had shifted. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. The documents and the pendant were crucial to understanding the next steps in his journey. The man took a moment to collect himself and review the information he had gathered. The labyrinth was relentless in its challenges, but he had gained valuable insights and tools that would aid him in the trials ahead. With renewed determination, he moved toward the next phase of the labyrinth, ready to confront whatever lay beyond the pit of reflection. The journey continued, and the man knew that each step brought him closer to the ultimate goal of escape. Chapter 12: The Labyrinth of Echoes. Emerging from the pit of reflection, the man found himself in a new chamber, markedly different from the previous rooms. The space was expansive, with walls that appeared to be made of polished, dark stone. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow. The chamber was illuminated by a series of soft, flickering lights embedded in the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the floor. The center of the chamber featured a large, ornate archway made of intricately carved stone. The archway was covered in cryptic symbols and runes, their meanings obscured by age. Beyond the archway, the man could see a network of passageways, each leading in different directions. The chamber itself was a crossroads, and the man realized that the true challenge lay in navigating the maze of passages. As he approached the archway, the air grew cooler, and a faint, eerie hum filled the chamber. The hum seemed to come from the walls themselves, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The man noticed that the archway was flanked by two tall, stone pillars, each adorned with a series of carvings that mirrored the symbols on the archway. The carvings were worn and faded, but they seemed to depict scenes of struggle and conflict. The man examined the archway closely. The symbols were familiar, echoing those he had encountered in previous chambers. They seemed to represent concepts of guidance and direction, suggesting that the archway was a key to navigating the labyrinth. He could feel that the archway held significance, but its purpose remained unclear. With no immediate way to discern the correct path, the man decided to step through the archway and into the network of passages. As he crossed the threshold, the chamber's ambient hum shifted, becoming more pronounced. The passages beyond the archway were narrow and winding, lined with the same dark stone as the chamber. The light sources were sporadic, casting erratic shadows that made it difficult to see clearly. The man ventured into the passages, using the faint light to guide his way. The labyrinth seemed to shift and change as he moved, with passages leading in unexpected directions and intersecting at strange angles. The walls were lined with small niches and alcoves, each containing ancient relics and objects of unknown purpose. As he navigated the maze, he began to notice a pattern in the labyrinth's layout. The passages seemed to form a series of interconnected loops, with certain sections repeating in a seemingly endless cycle. The man's sense of direction was continually challenged by the labyrinth's deceptive design. He could not tell whether he was moving forward or merely circling back to where he had started. To aid his navigation, The man took note of any distinctive features or landmarks within the passages. He marked the walls with chalk, creating a crude map of the labyrinth as he progressed. The markings helped him keep track of his movements, but the labyrinth's complexity made it difficult to maintain a clear sense of direction. In one of the passages, he discovered a series of small, reflective mirrors embedded in the walls. The mirrors were arranged in a grid pattern, their surfaces polished to a high sheen. As he passed by, the mirrors caught the light and created a dazzling display of reflections and refractions. The shifting patterns in the mirrors seemed to distort and confuse his perception, adding to the labyrinth's disorienting effect. The man continued through the labyrinth, navigating the maze of echoes and reflections. He encountered several more mirrors, each contributing to the optical illusion of endless passages. The constant play of light and shadow created a surreal experience, making it challenging to discern reality from illusion. At one point, he came across a small chamber within the labyrinth, its walls adorned with a series of intricate carvings. The carvings depicted a narrative of struggle and perseverance, with figures battling against forces of darkness. The images seemed to resonate with the man's own journey, reflecting themes of endurance and resilience. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal holding a large, ornate compass. The compass was old and weathered, its surface etched with the same cryptic symbols that adorned the archway. The man took the compass and examined it closely. Its needle swung erratically, indicating a lack of true direction. The compass seemed to be both a tool and a challenge, reflecting the labyrinth's deceptive nature. The man realized that the compass might be a key to understanding the labyrinth's layout. He carefully studied the compass and compared it to the markings he had made on his map. The symbols on the compass aligned with certain features within the labyrinth, suggesting that the compass could be used to navigate through the maze. Using the compass as a guide, he continued to explore the labyrinth, following its erratic needle and the patterns he had observed in the passages. The compass's shifting direction seemed to lead him toward new sections of the maze, gradually revealing the labyrinth's true structure. Despite the challenges, the man began to make progress. He discovered hidden passages and secret chambers that had previously eluded him. Each new discovery provided additional clues and insights into the labyrinth's design. The compass proved to be an invaluable tool, helping him navigate the complex network of passages. As he ventured deeper into the labyrinth, the passages became less erratic and more structured. The maze began to take on a more defined form, with clear pathways and fewer deceptive loops. The man could feel that he was approaching the end of the maze, his progress marked by the steady improvement in the labyrinth's layout. Finally, he reached a large, circular chamber at the heart of the labyrinth. The chamber was illuminated by a series of torches mounted on the walls, casting a warm, flickering light. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal with a small, ornate box. The box was adorned with the same cryptic symbols as the compass and the archway. The man approached the pedestal and examined the box. The symbols on the box seemed to align with those on the compass, suggesting that the box was the key to completing the maze. He carefully opened the box and found a scroll inside. The scroll was old and fragile, its surface covered in detailed diagrams and instructions. The diagrams on the scroll depicted a series of interconnected passages, showing the layout of the labyrinth in its entirety. The instructions explained the significance of the symbols and the purpose of the compass. The scroll provided a clear path through the remaining sections of the labyrinth, offering guidance and insight into the final stages of the journey. With the scroll in hand and the labyrinth's layout now clear, the man prepared to leave the chamber. The maze had been a test of his patience and perseverance, challenging him to navigate its deceptive passages and echoes. The compass and the scroll had provided the tools he needed to complete the journey. He left the chamber and followed the path outlined in the scroll, making his way through the remaining sections of the labyrinth. The passages were now straightforward and easy to navigate, leading him toward the exit. The man felt a sense of accomplishment as he emerged from the maze, ready to face the next challenge in his relentless pursuit of escape. Chapter 13. The Chamber of Choices. After emerging from the labyrinth of echoes, the man entered a new chamber, markedly different from the previous environments. This chamber was spacious and austere, with walls constructed from rough-hewn stone. The floor was smooth and polished, reflecting the dim light that emanated from sconces mounted along the walls. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps. The chamber was divided into 3 distinct sections by heavy, wrought iron gates. Each section was separated by a wide, arching corridor that led to a different area of the room. The gates were intricately designed, with elaborate patterns and symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, supernatural light. The gates were locked, and each was guarded by a different mechanism. In the center of the chamber stood a large, circular pedestal. Upon the pedestal rested 3 ornate boxes, each decorated with symbols and carvings that matched the designs on the gates. The boxes were closed and appeared to be sealed with intricate locks. Each box had a distinct pattern of symbols on its surface, corresponding to the designs on the gates. At the base of the pedestal were 3 sets of levers, each positioned in front of one of the gates. The levers were marked with the same symbols as the boxes and gates. Next to the levers were small, metal plaques with inscriptions that were faded and difficult to read. The inscriptions seemed to offer cryptic hints about the choices that needed to be made. The man approached the pedestal and examined the 3 boxes. Each box had a different color and design, and they seemed to be linked to the 3 gates. He noted the symbols on the boxes, comparing them to the patterns on the gates and the levers. The complexity of the design suggested that each choice had a significant impact on the path forward. He decided to investigate the levers and their corresponding gates. The levers were mounted on a series of metal stands, each engraved with a distinct set of symbols. The man carefully studied each set of symbols, noting their similarities and differences. The levers were positioned in different orientations, and he could see that moving them would affect the gates and possibly open one of them. The man first examined the leftmost gate. The gate was adorned with intricate carvings and symbols that matched those on the corresponding box. The gate was tall and imposing, with iron bars that were thick and solid. The lock mechanism was complex, featuring a series of interlocking gears and cogs that required careful manipulation. He then turned his attention to the middle gate. This gate had a different set of symbols, and its design was more elaborate than the leftmost gate. The gate was decorated with engravings of mythical creatures and abstract patterns. The lock mechanism on this gate was similarly intricate, with a series of moving parts that seemed to respond to specific combinations. Finally, the man examined the rightmost gate. This gate had yet another set of symbols, featuring designs that were more geometric and less ornate than the other 2 gates. The lock mechanism was straightforward in comparison, with a simpler arrangement of gears and levers. The man knew that each gate led to a different path, and the choices he made would determine his progress. He approached the levers and began to experiment with their positions, observing the effects on the gates. Moving a lever caused the corresponding gate to shift and rattle, but none of the gates opened immediately. He decided to focus on the boxes on the pedestal. Each box was locked with a different mechanism, and he realized that he needed to unlock one of the boxes to gain further insight into the choices he faced. The boxes were adorned with intricate carvings and symbols, and each had a unique design that seemed to correspond to one of the gates. The man selected the leftmost box and began to examine its lock. The The lock was adorned with a series of interlocking patterns that matched the symbols on the gate. He carefully manipulated the lock, using the symbols as a guide. After several attempts, he managed to unlock the box. Inside, he found a small, silver key and a parchment with cryptic writing. The key was intricately designed and seemed to be intended for a specific purpose. The parchment contained symbols and diagrams that appeared to correspond to the levers and gates. The writing on the parchment was faded and difficult to decipher, but the man could make out certain patterns and clues that suggested a connection between the key and the mechanisms. The man took the key and approached the middle gate. He used the key to unlock the gate's mechanism, which opened with a resounding clunk. The gate creaked open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The passage was dimly lit and seemed to lead deeper into the labyrinth. He hesitated for a moment, considering his options. The parchment and the key had provided some guidance, but the chamber still held many secrets. He decided to explore the passage behind the middle gate, following the clues he had found. As he ventured down the passage, he encountered a series of obstacles and challenges. The passage was narrow and winding, with sharp turns and sudden drops. He had to navigate carefully, using the light from his torch to illuminate the path ahead. The passage was filled with traps and hazards, including hidden pitfalls and pressure plates that triggered mechanical devices. Despite the challenges, the man made steady progress. He used the key and the information from the parchment to bypass obstacles and unlock hidden compartments. The passage eventually led to a small chamber filled with ancient relics and artifacts. The chamber was adorned with symbols and carvings that matched those on the boxes and gates. In the center of the chamber was a large, stone pedestal holding a second box. The box was similar to the ones on the pedestal in the main chamber, but it was adorned with additional symbols and patterns. The man approached the box and examined it closely. It appeared to be locked with a different mechanism, and he realized that he needed to solve a puzzle to open it. The man studied the symbols on the box and compared them to those on the pedestal in the main chamber. He noticed that the symbols formed a pattern that matched the arrangements of the levers. He carefully manipulated the levers and observed the effects on the gate mechanisms, using the patterns as a guide. After several attempts, he managed to unlock the second box. Inside, he found a set of ancient scrolls and a map of the labyrinth. The scrolls contained detailed instructions and diagrams related to the labyrinth's design and mechanisms. The map provided a comprehensive layout of the labyrinth, showing the locations of hidden passages and secret chambers. With the scrolls and the map in hand, the man returned to the main chamber. He used the information from the scrolls to decipher the remaining symbols and mechanisms. The map provided valuable insights into the layout of the labyrinth, helping him navigate the remaining sections. The man continued to explore the chamber and the passages beyond, using the information he had gathered to guide his journey. The Chamber of Choices had been a test of his ingenuity and problem-solving skills, but he had emerged with valuable tools and knowledge. He knew that the labyrinth was far from over, and the choices he made would continue to shape his path. With renewed determination, he prepared to face the next challenges in his quest for escape. The Chamber of Choices had tested his resolve, but he was ready to confront whatever lay ahead. Chapter 14: The Vault of Shadows. As the man progressed through the labyrinth, he emerged into a new chamber, markedly different from the previous ones. This chamber, known as the Vault of Shadows, was a vast, dimly lit space with an oppressive atmosphere. The walls were constructed from dark, rough-hewn stone, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. The only illumination came from a series of flickering torches mounted on the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted with each gust of a cold, unseen breeze. At the far end of the chamber stood a large, imposing vault door. The door was crafted from iron and adorned with intricate carvings that depicted scenes of darkness and despair. The carvings were covered in a layer of grime, and the iron had corroded over time, giving the door a foreboding appearance. The vault door was secured with a complex locking mechanism, featuring a series of gears, cogs, and levers arranged in a seemingly random pattern. The man approached the vault door and examined the locking mechanism. The gears and cogs were interlocked in a way that suggested a need for precise manipulation. He noticed a set of symbols etched into the surface of the door, corresponding to those on the previous mechanisms he had encountered. These symbols appeared to represent various aspects of the vault's design, including shadows, light, and darkness. The man observed that the mechanism had several components that needed to be aligned correctly. There were multiple levers and rotating dials that required careful adjustment. He began by experimenting with the levers, pulling and pushing them to see how they affected the mechanism. Each movement caused the gears and cogs to shift and click, but the vault door remained firmly closed. He then turned his attention to the rotating dials. The dials were engraved with symbols and patterns that matched those on the vault door. The man realized that aligning the dials correctly was crucial to unlocking the vault. He carefully rotated the dials, adjusting them to align with the symbols on the door. As he worked, the gears and cogs shifted and adjusted, creating a series of audible clicks and clanks. Despite his efforts, the vault door remained closed. The man began to notice subtle changes in the chamber's atmosphere as he adjusted the dials and levers. The flickering torches cast longer, more menacing shadows, and the cold breeze grew stronger. He could feel a sense of unease growing as the chamber seemed to react to his actions. He decided to investigate the rest of the chamber for additional clues or mechanisms that might assist him in unlocking the vault. As he explored, he discovered a series of alcoves and recesses along the walls. Each alcove contained ancient relics and objects covered in dust and cobwebs. The objects ranged from old tools and devices to strange, unidentifiable artifacts. In one of the alcoves, he found a collection of old, tattered scrolls. The scrolls were fragile and faded, but they appeared to contain diagrams and instructions related to the vault's mechanism. The diagrams depicted a series of gears, levers, and dials, with annotations that suggested specific configurations for unlocking the vault. The man carefully examined the scrolls, using the information to guide his adjustments to the mechanism. He followed the instructions and realigned the gears and dials according to the diagrams. With each adjustment, he could hear the gears and cogs shifting more smoothly, but the vault door remained obstinately closed. As he continued to work on the mechanism, the man noticed a hidden compartment near the base of the vault door. The compartment was covered by a sliding panel, and it was partially concealed by shadows. He managed to open the panel, revealing a small metal box. The box was adorned with the same symbols as the vault door and the levers. He opened the metal box and found a set of small metal rods and a brass key. The rods were engraved with symbols that matched those on the vault door, and the key appeared to be intricately designed. The man took the rods and examined them closely, noting their similarity to the components of the locking mechanism. The man inserted the metal rods into the slots of the vault door's mechanism. The rods fit perfectly, and he began to adjust them according to the symbols and patterns on the door. As he worked, the gears and cogs moved more fluidly, and the mechanism began to respond more predictably. With the rods in place, the man used the brass key to make final adjustments to the mechanism. He turned the key, and the vault door began to creak and groan as it slowly opened. The process was gradual and laborious, but the door eventually swung open, revealing the interior of the vault. Inside the vault, the man discovered a series of darkened alcoves and shelves filled with ancient artifacts and objects of unknown purpose. The vault was lined with shelves that held an array of strange and mysterious items, including old tomes, dusty scrolls, and elaborate ceremonial masks. The air inside the vault was cold and musty, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper as he explored. In the center of the vault stood a large stone pedestal. Upon the pedestal rested a final box, similar in design to the ones he had encountered before. The box was adorned with elaborate carvings and symbols, and it appeared to be the key to unlocking the final stage of his journey. The man approached the pedestal and examined the box closely. The box was locked with a different mechanism than the others, and he could see that it required a specific combination of symbols and adjustments to open. He carefully manipulated the mechanism, using the information he had gathered from the scrolls and the vault's relics. As he worked, the atmosphere in the vault seemed to change. The flickering torches cast long, shifting shadows that created eerie patterns on the walls. The temperature dropped, and a sense of foreboding filled the chamber. The man could feel the presence of something unseen, lurking in the darkness. After several attempts, he managed to unlock the final box. Inside, he found a collection of ancient manuscripts and a detailed map of the labyrinth. The manuscripts contained instructions and clues related to the final stages of the journey, including information about hidden passages and secret chambers. With the manuscripts and the map in hand, the man prepared to leave the Vault of Shadows. The chamber had been a test of his patience and resourcefulness, challenging him to navigate its complex mechanisms and uncover its secrets. He knew that the labyrinth was far from over, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. He left the vault and continued his journey through the labyrinth, using the information he had gathered to guide his path. The Vault of Shadows had tested his resolve and ingenuity, but he was determined to complete the final stages of his quest. Chapter 15. The Chamber of Reflections. Emerging from the Vault of Shadows, the man found himself in a new chamber, distinct from the previous ones. This chamber was both vast and enigmatic, with walls lined from floor to ceiling with tall, polished mirrors. The mirrors were arranged in a grid pattern, reflecting the dim light from sconces placed intermittently around the room. The reflections created an illusion of endless space, with countless versions of the man's image stretching into the distance. The floor of the chamber was made of smooth, black marble that shimmered under the soft light. The ceiling was lost in shadow, adding to the chamber's disorienting effect. In the center of the room stood a large, circular pedestal covered in a layer of fine dust. On the pedestal rested a single, ornate mirror, its frame decorated with intricate carvings and symbols. As the man approached the pedestal, he noticed that the central mirror was different from the others. It was larger and more elaborately designed, with a gilded frame adorned with a series of enigmatic symbols. The surface of the mirror was pristine and clear, offering a stark contrast to the other mirrors in the chamber, which were slightly tarnished and obscured. The man examined the central mirror closely, noting the symbols around its frame. The symbols appeared to be a combination of abstract patterns and familiar designs, hinting at a deeper significance. He could sense that the mirror held a key to understanding the chamber's purpose. He turned his attention to the other mirrors lining the walls. Each mirror was framed similarly, but with different carvings. As he moved through the room, he noticed that the reflections in the mirrors shifted and changed with each step he took. The reflections seemed to warp and distort, creating an unsettling and surreal experience. He began to explore the mirrors, noting how they affected his perception of the chamber. The reflections in some mirrors appeared to be slightly altered, with the images appearing elongated or compressed. In others, the reflections seemed to flicker and shimmer, as if they were being viewed through a veil. The man soon realized that the mirrors were not just passive reflections, but part of an intricate puzzle. The distorted reflections and shifting images seemed to offer clues about how to interact with the central mirror. He approached each mirror carefully, observing how the reflections changed as he adjusted his position. In one of the corners of the room, he found a small, concealed compartment hidden behind a movable panel. Inside the compartment were several small, ornate objects, including a set of polished crystal spheres and a collection of metal rods. Each object was inscribed with symbols that matched those on the central mirror. He took the objects and examined them closely. The crystal spheres were translucent and refracted light in interesting ways, while the metal rods were engraved with a series of intricate patterns. The objects seemed to be tools for manipulating the reflections in the mirrors. The man began to experiment with the objects, positioning the crystal spheres and metal rods in front of the mirrors. He noticed that the spheres could focus and redirect light, creating patterns and reflections that interacted with the other mirrors. The metal rods could be used to adjust the alignment of the mirrors and the central mirror. As he worked with the objects, he discovered that the reflections in the mirrors began to align and form coherent patterns. The shifting images and distorted reflections started to resolve into clear and meaningful designs. The patterns suggested a path or a sequence that needed to be followed. Using the crystal spheres and metal rods, the man adjusted the mirrors to align with the patterns. He carefully positioned the objects and observed the effects on the reflections. As the mirrors were aligned correctly, the reflections began to reveal hidden messages and symbols etched into the surfaces of the mirrors. In the center of the room, the central mirror started to change. The surface of the mirror began to ripple and shimmer, and the symbols around its frame glowed with a faint, ethereal light. The mirror's surface began to display a series of images and diagrams that appeared to be related to the labyrinth's design. The man studied the images in the central mirror. The diagrams depicted a series of interconnected passages and chambers, similar to those he had encountered in the labyrinth. The images also showed various mechanisms and symbols that seemed to be linked to the other mirrors in the chamber. He realized that the central mirror was providing a map or guide to the remaining sections of the labyrinth. The images and diagrams offered clues about the locations of hidden passages and secret chambers, as well as information about the mechanisms he needed to interact with. With the information from the central mirror, the man began to navigate the chamber more effectively. He used the clues and diagrams to adjust the other mirrors and align them with the patterns revealed in the central mirror. As he worked, he could see the reflections in the mirrors resolving into clear and coherent images. Eventually, the reflections began to reveal a hidden passageway behind one of the mirrors. The mirror slid open to reveal a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The corridor was lined with symbols and markings that matched those on the central mirror, suggesting a connection between the two. The man entered the corridor, following the path revealed by the reflections. The corridor was narrow and winding, with sharp turns and sudden drops. The walls were lined with the same polished stone as the rest of the labyrinth, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust. As he progressed through the corridor, he encountered several obstacles and challenges. The corridor was filled with traps and hazards, including hidden pitfalls and pressure plates that triggered mechanical devices. He used the information from the central mirror to bypass the obstacles and navigate the corridor safely. The corridor eventually led to a small chamber filled with ancient relics and artifacts. The chamber was adorned with symbols and carvings that matched those on the central mirror. In the center of the chamber was a large, stone pedestal holding a final box. The box was similar in design to the ones he had encountered before, but was adorned with additional symbols and patterns. The man approached the pedestal and examined the box closely. He realized that unlocking the box would provide him with the final clues needed to complete the labyrinth. He carefully manipulated the locking mechanism on the box, using the information from the central mirror and the chamber of reflections. After several attempts, he managed to unlock the box. Inside, he found a detailed map of the labyrinth and a set of ancient scrolls containing instructions and clues for the remaining stages of his journey. With the map and scrolls in hand, the man prepared to leave the chamber of reflections. The chamber had been a test of his perception and ingenuity, challenging him to interact with the mirrors and solve the puzzle of the reflections. He knew that the labyrinth was far from over, and he was ready to face the next challenge. He left the chamber and continued his journey through the labyrinth, using the information he had gathered to guide his path. The Chamber of Reflections had provided him with valuable insights and tools for the final stages of his quest, and he was determined to complete the journey. Chapter 16: The Labyrinth of Echoes. After leaving the Chamber of Reflections, the man entered a new section of the labyrinth, known as the Labyrinth of Echoes. This area was a vast, cavernous space with walls that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The floor was uneven and covered in loose gravel, causing the man's footsteps to echo eerily throughout the chamber. The Labyrinth of Echoes was lined with tall, imposing columns that supported a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The columns were adorned with ancient carvings and inscriptions, adding to the sense of grandeur and mystery. The air was cool and damp, with a faint, persistent hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The chamber was divided into multiple corridors and passageways, each leading to different areas of the labyrinth. The walls of these corridors were lined with similar columns and carvings, creating a maze-like environment that was difficult to navigate. The echoes of the man's footsteps created a disorienting effect, making it hard to discern which direction to follow. At the center of the chamber stood a large, stone archway. The archway was intricately carved with symbols and patterns that matched those on the columns and walls. The archway led to a narrow, winding passage that seemed to disappear into the darkness. The man approached the archway and examined its carvings, noting the symbols that appeared to form a complex pattern. He decided to explore the corridors and passageways surrounding the archway. Each corridor had a different arrangement of columns and carvings, and the echoes created a disorienting effect that made it difficult to keep track of his location. The man used the echoes to his advantage, trying to determine the layout of the labyrinth and identify any potential clues. As he navigated the corridors, he noticed that certain areas of the walls were covered in faded inscriptions and symbols. The inscriptions appeared to be written in an ancient script, and the symbols seemed to correspond to those on the archway and the columns. The man studied the inscriptions, trying to decipher their meaning and understand how they related to the labyrinth. In one of the corridors, he discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose column. The compartment contained a series of small, metal objects and a set of ancient scrolls. The objects were engraved with symbols that matched those on the archway and the inscriptions on the walls. The scrolls contained diagrams and instructions related to the labyrinth's design and mechanisms. The man took the objects and scrolls and continued his exploration. He used the information from the scrolls to guide his navigation through the labyrinth, paying close attention to the symbols and patterns. The diagrams provided valuable insights into the layout of the labyrinth and the locations of hidden passages and traps. As he progressed, he encountered several obstacles and challenges. The corridors were filled with traps and hazards, including hidden pressure plates and mechanical devices. The man used the information from the scrolls and the metal objects to bypass the obstacles and navigate safely through the labyrinth. Eventually, he reached a large, central chamber within the Labyrinth of Echoes. The chamber was filled with an array of ancient relics and artifacts, including old tomes, dusty scrolls, and ceremonial masks. The chamber was adorned with intricate carvings and symbols that matched those on the archway and the columns. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone pedestal. Upon the pedestal rested a final box, similar in design to the ones he had encountered before. The box was adorned with elaborate carvings and symbols, and it appeared to be the key to unlocking the next stage of his journey. The man approached the pedestal and examined the box closely. The box was locked with a complex mechanism, featuring a series of interlocking gears and cogs. The mechanism was adorned with symbols and patterns that matched those on the archway and the inscriptions on the walls. He carefully manipulated the mechanism, using the information from the scrolls and the metal objects. The gears and cogs shifted and adjusted, creating a series of audible clicks and clanks. Despite his efforts, the box remained closed. The man realized that he needed to align the symbols and patterns correctly to unlock the box. He continued to work on the mechanism, adjusting the gears and cogs according to the patterns and symbols. As he worked, he noticed that the echoes in the chamber seemed to respond to his actions. The echoes created a symphony of sounds that provided clues about the alignment of the symbols and the mechanism's operation. With each adjustment, the echoes became clearer and more distinct, guiding him toward the correct configuration. After several attempts, he managed to unlock the box. Inside, he found a detailed map of the labyrinth and a set of ancient scrolls containing instructions and clues for the remaining stages of his journey. The map provided a comprehensive layout of the labyrinth, showing the locations of hidden passages and secret chambers. The scrolls contained valuable information about the mechanisms and traps in the labyrinth, as well as clues for navigating the remaining sections. With the map and scrolls in hand, the man prepared to leave the labyrinth of echoes. The chamber had been a test of his navigation and problem-solving skills, challenging him to use the echoes and symbols to uncover its secrets. He knew that the labyrinth was far from over, and he was ready to face the next challenge. He left the chamber and continued his journey through the labyrinth, using the information he had gathered to guide his path. The labyrinth of echoes had provided him with valuable tools and insights for the final stages of his quest, and he was determined to complete the journey. Chapter 17: The Chamber of Time. The man emerged from the labyrinth of echoes into a new chamber known as the Chamber of Time. This room was unlike any he had encountered before, with a grand, almost otherworldly atmosphere. The walls were lined with an array of ancient clocks, each displaying a different time and adorned with intricate carvings. The ceiling was high, with a large, ornate clock embedded into its center. The air was filled with the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clocks, creating a hypnotic and mesmerizing sound. The floor was covered in polished tiles arranged in a circular pattern, radiating outward from the center of the room. The tiles were inscribed with symbols and numbers that seemed to correspond to the times displayed on the clocks. In the center of the room stood a large, elaborate hourglass, its sand flowing slowly from the upper chamber to the lower. The hourglass was encased in a gilded frame adorned with symbols and patterns that matched those on the floor. At the far end of the chamber, the man noticed a set of large, wooden doors. The doors were intricately carved with scenes depicting the passage of time, including celestial bodies, seasons, and cycles of nature. The doors were secured with a complex mechanism that appeared to be related to the clocks and the hourglass in the room. The man began by examining the clocks on the walls. Each clock was set to a different time, and the hands of the clocks moved slowly and methodically. The clocks were adorned with various symbols and patterns, some of which matched those on the floor and the hourglass. The man realized that understanding the clocks and their times was crucial to solving the puzzle of the chamber. He approached the hourglass and studied its design. The hourglass was filled with fine, golden sand that flowed slowly from the upper chamber to the lower. The sand created a rhythmic ticking sound as it cascaded down, adding to the chamber's atmosphere. The man noticed that the hourglass was surrounded by a series of dials and levers that seemed to be part of the locking mechanism for the wooden doors. He began to experiment with the dials and levers, adjusting them to see how they affected the hourglass and the clocks. Each adjustment caused the sand in the hourglass to flow more quickly or slowly, and the clocks on the walls responded with changes in their ticking rates. The man observed that the symbols and numbers on the floor shifted in response to the changes in the hourglass and the clocks. As he worked, he realized that the clocks and the hourglass were interconnected. The times displayed on the clocks seemed to influence the flow of sand in the hourglass, and the adjustments to the hourglass affected the times on the clocks. He needed to synchronize the clocks and the hourglass to unlock the mechanism and open the wooden doors. The man used the information from the previous chambers to guide his adjustments. He referred to the map and scrolls he had found, which provided clues about the symbols and patterns related to the passage of time. He carefully aligned the clocks to specific times and adjusted the hourglass to match the patterns on the floor. Despite his efforts, the mechanism remained unresponsive. The man noticed that the symbols and numbers on the floor were shifting and changing in response to his adjustments. He realized that he needed to find a specific sequence or pattern that would synchronize the clocks and the hourglass correctly. He decided to investigate the walls and the carvings on the wooden doors. The carvings depicted scenes of celestial events and natural cycles, including the phases of the moon, the changing seasons, and the movement of the sun. The carvings seemed to offer clues about the sequence and timing needed to unlock the mechanism. The man took note of the patterns and symbols on the carvings and used them to guide his adjustments. He aligned the clocks and the hourglass according to the sequences depicted in the carvings, trying to match the timings and patterns. As he worked, the ticking of the clocks became more synchronized, and the flow of sand in the hourglass matched the rhythm of the ticking. Eventually, the mechanism responded to his adjustments. The large wooden doors began to creak and groan as they slowly opened, revealing the next section of the labyrinth. The man stepped through the doors and found himself in a new chamber, with a different atmosphere and set of challenges. The new chamber was filled with ancient artifacts and relics related to the passage of time. The walls were adorned with intricate designs and symbols, and the floor was covered with a series of interconnected gears and cogs. The man realized that he needed to use the artifacts and relics to solve the next puzzle and continue his journey. He approached the artifacts and examined them closely. The artifacts included old timepieces, astronomical instruments, and mechanical devices. Each artifact was inscribed with symbols and patterns that matched those in the previous chamber. The man used the artifacts to interact with the gears and cogs on the floor, aligning them to create a functioning mechanism. As he worked, he noticed that the artifacts and relics began to respond to his actions. The gears and cogs shifted and adjusted, creating a series of clicks and clanks. The mechanism started to move smoothly, and the artifacts began to interact with the gears, revealing hidden passages and secret chambers. The man continued to explore the new chamber, using the artifacts and relics to navigate the interconnected gears and cogs. He uncovered several hidden passages and discovered valuable clues about the remaining stages of the labyrinth. The chamber was a test of his understanding of time and mechanics, challenging him to use the artifacts to solve complex puzzles and unlock new areas. With the information and clues he had gathered, the man prepared to leave the Chamber of Time. The chamber had been a significant challenge, testing his ability to synchronize clocks, adjust mechanisms, and navigate complex puzzles. He knew that the labyrinth was nearing its end, and he was determined to complete the final stages of his journey. He left the chamber and continued his exploration of the labyrinth, using the knowledge and tools he had acquired to guide his path. The Chamber of Time had provided him with valuable insights into the nature of time and mechanics, and he was ready to face the remaining challenges. Chapter 18: The Chamber of Illusions. Upon exiting the Chamber of Time, the man entered a new and disorienting space known as the Chamber of Illusions. This chamber was an expansive, surreal environment with walls, floors, and ceilings covered in intricate, shifting patterns and vibrant colors. The room appeared to warp and bend, creating an ever-changing landscape that challenged his sense of reality. The floor was a mosaic of shifting tiles, each adorned with abstract designs and patterns that seemed to move and change. The tiles formed a complex labyrinthine pattern that was difficult to navigate. The walls were covered with mirrors of various sizes and shapes, each reflecting a different part of the chamber and creating a confusing array of reflections and distortions. The ceiling was a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes, adding to the chamber's disorienting effect. In the center of the room, the man noticed a large, ornate pedestal. Upon the pedestal rested a crystal orb, glowing with an otherworldly light. The orb seemed to be the focal point of the chamber, and the man felt compelled to investigate it further. Around the pedestal were several mechanisms and levers, each adorned with symbols and patterns that matched those on the floor and walls. The man approached the pedestal and examined the crystal orb closely. The orb was filled with swirling mist and emitted a soft, pulsating light. The mechanisms and levers surrounding the pedestal seemed to be part of a puzzle or control system that needed to be solved in order to progress. He began by exploring the mirrors on the walls. Each mirror reflected different aspects of the chamber, including distorted images of the pedestal and the orb. The reflections created an illusion of multiple orbs and pedestals, making it challenging to discern the true position of the crystal orb. The man realized that understanding the reflections and the shifting patterns on the floor was crucial to solving the puzzle. The man moved through the chamber, carefully observing the patterns and designs on the floor. The tiles shifted and changed as he walked, creating an ever-changing path. He noticed that certain tiles seemed to align with the reflections in the mirrors, forming coherent patterns and pathways. He used this information to guide his movements and navigate the labyrinthine floor. As he explored the mirrors, he discovered that some of them were partially obscured by panels that could be adjusted or moved. By manipulating these panels, he was able to alter the reflections and reveal hidden aspects of the chamber. The man used this information to align the reflections and create a clear path to the pedestal. The mechanisms and levers around the pedestal appeared to be related to the crystal orb. Each mechanism was engraved with symbols and patterns that matched those on the floor and walls. The man began to experiment with the mechanisms, adjusting the levers and dials to see how they affected the orb and the reflections in the mirrors. He noticed that certain adjustments to the mechanisms caused the crystal orb to change color and intensity. The orb's light interacted with the shifting patterns on the floor and the reflections in the mirrors, creating a series of optical illusions and visual effects. The man realized that he needed to synchronize the mechanisms and the orb to solve the puzzle and unlock the next stage of the labyrinth. Using the information from the reflections and the shifting patterns on the floor, he carefully adjusted the mechanisms. The orb's light began to interact with the patterns and reflections, creating coherent images and designs. The illusions started to resolve into clear patterns and pathways, guiding him toward the next part of the chamber. As he worked, the man discovered that the shifting patterns on the floor and the reflections in the mirrors revealed hidden passages and compartments. By aligning the mechanisms and the orb correctly, he was able to reveal these hidden areas and uncover valuable clues about the labyrinth. Eventually, the man managed to synchronize the mechanisms and the crystal orb. The orb's light created a series of intricate patterns on the floor and the walls, revealing a hidden passage behind one of the mirrors. The mirror slid open to reveal a narrow corridor leading to a new chamber. The man entered the corridor and followed it to the next chamber. The new chamber was filled with ancient artifacts and relics related to illusions and perception. The walls were adorned with optical illusions and visual tricks, and the floor was covered with a series of interconnected gears and mechanisms. In the center of the chamber stood a large, ornate box, similar in design to the ones he had encountered before. The box was adorned with symbols and patterns that matched those in the previous chambers. The man approached the box and examined its locking mechanism, which featured a series of interlocking gears and dials. He carefully manipulated the mechanism, using the information from the crystal orb and the illusions in the chamber. The gears and dials shifted and adjusted, creating a series of clicks and clanks. The box remained locked, but the man realized that he needed to align the symbols and patterns correctly to unlock it. He continued to work on the mechanism, adjusting the gears and dials according to the patterns and symbols in the chamber. As he worked, the optical illusions and visual tricks in the room began to resolve into clear and coherent images. The mechanism started to function smoothly, and the box's locking mechanism began to respond. After several attempts, the man managed to unlock the box. Inside, he found a detailed map of the labyrinth and a set of ancient scrolls containing instructions and clues for the remaining stages of his journey. The map provided a comprehensive layout of the labyrinth, and the scrolls contained valuable information about the final challenges. With the map and scrolls in hand, the man prepared to leave the Chamber of Illusions. The chamber had been a test of his perception and problem-solving skills, challenging him to navigate shifting patterns and optical illusions. He knew that the labyrinth was nearing its end, and he was determined to complete the final stages of his journey. He left the chamber and continued his exploration of the labyrinth, using the knowledge and tools he had acquired to guide his path. The Chamber of Illusions had provided him with valuable insights into the nature of perception and illusion, and he was ready to face the remaining challenges. Chapter 19: The Chamber of Shadows. The man left the Chamber of Illusions and entered a new and ominous space, known as the Chamber of Shadows. This chamber was starkly different from the vibrant and shifting environment he had previously encountered. The room was dimly lit, with only faint, flickering torches casting eerie shadows on the walls. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was heavy with a sense of foreboding. The walls of the chamber were lined with ancient, dark tapestries that depicted scenes of mythical creatures and shadowy figures. The tapestries seemed to shift and move in the flickering torchlight, adding to the chamber's unsettling atmosphere. The ceiling was high and vaulted, with a series of hanging, intricately carved wooden panels that created a labyrinthine pattern. In the center of the chamber stood a large, ornate altar. The altar was covered in dark, tarnished metal and adorned with occult symbols and intricate carvings. Upon the altar rested a series of shadowy figures and artifacts, including old books, ceremonial knives, and strange, dark crystals. The altar seemed to be the focal point of the chamber, and the man felt drawn to it. The man began by examining the tapestries on the walls. Each tapestry was covered in elaborate designs and symbols, many of which seemed to shift and change in the shadows. The man realized that understanding the symbols and patterns on the tapestries was crucial to solving the puzzle of the chamber. He carefully studied the designs, noting their connections to the altar and the artifacts. He moved cautiously around the chamber, avoiding areas where the shadows seemed particularly dense and ominous. The floor was covered in intricate, faded patterns that seemed to shift and change as he walked. The patterns created a maze-like effect, with pathways that appeared and disappeared as the shadows moved. The man approached the altar and examined the artifacts closely. The books were old and worn, their pages yellowed and brittle. The ceremonial knives were covered in intricate engravings, and the dark crystals seemed to absorb the dim light from the torches. The man noticed that the artifacts were arranged in a specific pattern on the altar, with each item positioned according to certain symbols and designs. He carefully moved the artifacts and adjusted their positions, trying to align them with the patterns on the floor and the symbols on the tapestries. The altar seemed to respond to his actions, with subtle changes in the shadows and flickering light. The man realized that he needed to synchronize the artifacts and the patterns to unlock the mechanism and reveal the next stage of the labyrinth. As he worked, he encountered several obstacles and challenges. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, creating shifting figures and forms that obscured his view and made navigation difficult. The man used the flickering torchlight to guide his movements and avoid areas where the shadows seemed to intensify. He discovered that certain areas of the floor and the tapestries were covered in hidden mechanisms. By adjusting the positions of the artifacts and aligning them with the symbols and patterns, he was able to reveal these mechanisms and activate them. The mechanisms created a series of audible clicks and clanks, signaling that he was making progress. The man continued to explore the chamber, using the information from the tapestries and the artifacts to guide his movements. He uncovered several hidden passages and compartments, each containing valuable clues and instructions for the remaining stages of the labyrinth. The chamber was a test of his ability to navigate shadows and align artifacts, challenging him to use both observation and intuition. Eventually, the man discovered a hidden compartment behind one of the tapestries. The compartment contained a set of ancient scrolls and a series of small, shadowy figurines. The scrolls provided detailed instructions about the remaining challenges and the mechanisms of the labyrinth. The figurines were adorned with symbols and patterns that matched those on the altar and the floor. The man used the scrolls and figurines to guide his adjustments of the artifacts on the altar. He carefully aligned the figurines and positioned them according to the instructions on the scrolls. The artifacts began to respond, and the shadows in the chamber started to shift and change in a more coherent pattern. As he worked, the man noticed that the flickering torches began to stabilize, and the shadows became less chaotic. The altar's carvings and symbols started to glow faintly, and the mechanisms within the chamber began to activate. The large wooden panels hanging from the ceiling started to shift and move, revealing hidden passages and secret chambers. With the mechanisms activated, the man discovered a hidden passage behind the altar. The passage was narrow and dimly lit, leading to a new chamber filled with ancient relics and artifacts related to shadows and darkness. The walls of the new chamber were adorned with intricate carvings and symbols, and the floor was covered with a series of interconnected gears and levers. In the center of the chamber stood a large, ornate box, similar to the ones he had encountered before. The box was adorned with dark, mysterious symbols and patterns, and it appeared to be the key to unlocking the final stage of the labyrinth. The man approached the box and examined its locking mechanism, which featured a series of interlocking gears and dials. He used the information from the scrolls and the figurines to guide his adjustments. The gears and dials shifted and adjusted, creating a series of clicks and clanks. After several attempts, the man managed to unlock the box. Inside, he found a detailed map of the labyrinth and a set of ancient scrolls containing instructions and clues for the final challenges. The map provided a comprehensive layout of the labyrinth, and the scrolls contained valuable information about the remaining stages of his journey. With the map and scrolls in hand, the man prepared to leave the Chamber of Shadows. The chamber had been a test of his ability to navigate shadows and align artifacts, challenging him to use his observation and intuition. He knew that the labyrinth was nearing its end, and he was determined to complete the final stages of his journey. He left the chamber and continued his exploration of the labyrinth, using the knowledge and tools he had acquired to guide his path. The Chamber of Shadows had provided him with valuable insights into the nature of darkness and perception, and he was ready to face the remaining challenges. Chapter 20: The Chamber of Reckoning. The man entered the final chamber of the labyrinth, known as the Chamber of Reckoning. This chamber was stark and imposing, its atmosphere heavy with an aura of finality and judgment. The room was vast, with high, vaulted ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls were adorned with dark, ornate carvings depicting scenes of judgment and resolution. The floor was made of polished black stone, reflecting the dim, flickering light from the torches mounted on the walls. In the center of the chamber stood a large, imposing pedestal. Upon the pedestal rested a mysterious, ancient artifact, an ornate, intricately carved box with a series of symbols and patterns etched into its surface. The artifact seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy, and its presence dominated the room. Surrounding the pedestal were several other artifacts and mechanisms, each adorned with cryptic symbols and patterns. The man approached the pedestal and examined the artifact closely. The box was adorned with an elaborate locking mechanism, consisting of interlocking gears, dials, and levers. The symbols on the box matched those found in the previous chambers of the labyrinth. The man realized that unlocking the artifact was crucial to completing the labyrinth and reaching the final resolution. He began by inspecting the other artifacts and mechanisms in the chamber. Each artifact was adorned with symbols and patterns that seemed to correspond to those on the artifact box. The mechanisms included a series of interconnected gears, levers, and dials, all of which appeared to be part of a complex puzzle or control system. The man carefully studied the carvings on the walls, which depicted scenes of judgment and resolution. The carvings illustrated the final test of the labyrinth, where the man's actions and decisions would determine the outcome. He noticed that the carvings included symbols and patterns that matched those on the artifact and the mechanisms. He began to experiment with the mechanisms, adjusting the gears, levers, and dials to see how they affected the artifact. Each adjustment created a series of clicks and clanks, with subtle changes in the artifact's pulsating energy. The man realized that he needed to synchronize the mechanisms and the artifact to unlock the final puzzle. As he worked, he discovered that the symbols and patterns on the artifact and the mechanisms were interconnected. Aligning the symbols and patterns correctly was crucial to unlocking the artifact and completing the labyrinth. He used the information from the previous chambers and the carvings on the walls to guide his adjustments. The man continued to explore the chamber, uncovering hidden compartments and passages as he adjusted the mechanisms. He found several ancient scrolls and clues that provided additional information about the final challenge. The scrolls contained detailed instructions and insights into the nature of the final test. The artifact's locking mechanism was complex, with multiple layers and interlocking parts. The man needed to carefully align the gears, dials, and levers to unlock it. He used the scrolls and the symbols on the walls to guide his movements, making precise adjustments to the mechanisms. As he worked, the artifact began to respond. The pulsating energy became more intense, and the artifact's carvings started to glow faintly. The gears and levers moved smoothly, creating a series of audible clicks and adjustments. The man continued to align the symbols and patterns, gradually unlocking the layers of the mechanism. After several attempts, the man managed to unlock the artifact. The box opened to reveal a set of ancient scrolls and a detailed map of the labyrinth. The scrolls provided a comprehensive overview of the labyrinth's design and the final resolution. The map included detailed instructions for the final stage of the journey. With the scrolls and map in hand, the man prepared to complete the final challenge. The Chamber of Reckoning had been a test of his ability to synchronize mechanisms and align symbols, challenging him to use all of his skills and knowledge acquired throughout the labyrinth. He followed the instructions from the scrolls and used the map to guide his movements. The final stage of the labyrinth involved solving a series of complex puzzles and unlocking hidden passages. The man used the information from the previous chambers and the insights gained from the scrolls to navigate the final challenges. As he completed the final puzzles, the chamber began to change. The walls and floor shifted, revealing hidden passages and secret chambers. The artifact's pulsating energy became more intense, and the carvings on the walls illuminated, creating a dramatic and awe-inspiring effect. The man continued to explore the final stages of the labyrinth, using the map and scrolls to guide his path. He discovered several hidden treasures and relics, each providing valuable insights and clues about the labyrinth's purpose and design. The final challenge was a test of his endurance and problem-solving skills, requiring him to use all of his knowledge and experience to succeed. After completing the final stage, the man reached the end of the labyrinth. The Chamber of Reckoning had provided him with a profound understanding of the labyrinth's nature and purpose. The final artifact, scrolls, and map revealed the ultimate resolution and the meaning behind the labyrinth's trials. The man emerged from the labyrinth, his journey complete. The labyrinth had tested his abilities, endurance, and resolve, and he had succeeded in overcoming the final challenge. The experience had been a profound and transformative journey, offering valuable insights into the nature of judgment, resolution, and discovery. With the labyrinth behind him, the man stepped into a new chapter of his life, carrying with him the lessons and experiences gained from his journey through the Chamber of Reckoning and the labyrinth.